Chapter 264, Taking a Concubine, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. When the accessory case was opened, a sleek flash of light shone from within. All the spectating noble madams and ladies gasped in unison. A set of smooth, bright white pearl accessories was lying within the case, composed of a headdress, a necklace, a bracelet, a pair of earrings, and rings. The noble ladies gathered here had seen plenty of pearl accessories, but they had never seen such an elegant and eye-catching set before. The pearls weren't one of a kind, but the designs were enough to stun each and every one of the onlookers. The pearl necklace was the most impressive. On either side of the thin silver chain, there were white pearls interchanged with intricate little golden flowers, while two complicated-looking golden lotus flowers were entwined with each other and dangling from the center of the chain. Sitting in the center at the linking point of the lotus flower pattern was a smooth, silky golden pearl about the size of a thumbnail. Despite being surrounded by gold, the golden pearl didn't lose any bit of its own glow and instead looked even more lustrous, adding an aura of elegant luxury to the necklace. Actually, in this entire set of pearl accessories, this golden pearl was the main focus. It was also due to this golden pearl that the other normal pearls on the other accessories seemed even more white and ornate. The ladies were all stunned. They had never seen pearl accessories like these before. Even the accessories from the imperial palace couldn't match up to this. In a short moment, all the noble ladies were so entranced by the glowing pearls that they had forgotten to speak. Madame Zhu's pleased expression had instantly flipped the moment the accessory case had been opened. Though she had previously been able to keep her rage well hidden, this time, it was just too much. Irrespective of their ages, the ladies here lived luxurious lives, so they were naturally most interested in accessories and the like. While a rare 100-year-old ginseng might be able to make them gasp in surprise, a novel set of accessories would be able to make them go crazy. Countess Jingen hadn't looked at the accessory case yet. When she noticed the expressions of the crowd surrounding her didn't look right, she turned to look at her side. Now it was her turn to be stunned. Countess Jingen quickly came up with a light reprimand. Sanlang's wife. Dear child, how could you give me something so expensive? There weren't many women who didn't like dressing up in pretty clothes and jewelry. Everyone liked beautiful things. Even the sickly Countess Jingen wasn't an exception. Countess Jingen wouldn't have blamed Chu Lian if her gift had been ordinary. However, if her gift could make others envious, then of course she would be even more pleased with the gift. Now Countess Jingen felt that the love and effort she had spent on her youngest daughter-in-law hadn't been wasted at all. Chu Lian was a good child who knew how to repay kindness. After getting praised by her mother-in-law in front of a crowd, Chu Lian didn't reply with some nice-sounding empty words to win even more of her favor like Madame Zhu had. She stood up and curtsied towards Countess Jingen first before explaining with a smile, Mother, please rest assured. This accessory set isn't as expensive as it looks. The pearls are all easily bought from Jinsha Pavilion. It's only the designs that were personally drawn by me. I had one of Jinsha Pavilion's master craftsmen make it for me. Chu Lian really hadn't spent much on it. For 2 sets of pearl accessories and a few bracelets, it hadn't even cost 500 taels. Not only that, Jinsha Pavilion's manager had even given her quite a few free gifts in addition. Jinsha Pavilion's manager wanted to keep the novel design she had given them and research it. After hearing Chu Lian's explanation, Countess Jingen's heart melted. Her eyes were full of affection and helplessness. You silly child. You're just too honest. The noble madams here weren't empty-headed. They knew that it was precisely because of the novel design that Jinsha Pavilion would have specially made these accessories at a low price, just for honored Lady Jeannie. They really wanted a set of those accessories for themselves. However, it would probably cost at least 1,000 taels at Jinsha Pavilion. The crowd became even more envious. One of the madams in the crowd even smiled and said, even so, it's even more rare that honored Lady Jeannie could personally draw some new designs for the Countess. Furthermore, pearls aren't like those precious jewels, or even gold or silver. As we know, pearls nurture the health. I hear that when worn over a long period of time, they might even have calming and beautifying effect. Countess Jingen felt even more happier and touched after listening to this noble madam's words. The gaze she sent towards Chu Lian turned even warmer. The now completely ignored Madame Zhu gritted her teeth as the dissatisfaction in her heart grew even more. Her anger didn't fade after the gift-giving was over. Perhaps due to the grudge in her heart, she even made a few mistakes while preparing the seating arrangements for the banquet later, causing a few jokes at her expense. In the end, Matriarch He couldn't continue watching and sent senior servant Liu to help her. It was only then that the birthday banquet was completed successfully. When the guests had all departed and it was only their family left, the main branch was ordered to stay behind by Matriarch He and Countess Jing'an, right in front of the rest of the family. Chu Lian returned to Songtao Court with her servants. On the way back, Fuyan couldn't resist complaining next to Chu Lian's side. Third young madam, eldest young madam went overboard today. Do you think the matriarch kept eldest young madam behind to give her a scolding? Chu Lian turned back to look at Fuyan. What grandmother wants to say to eldest sister-in-law has nothing to do with our third branch. We just have to keep our own consciences clear in our actions. Her expression was indifferent. It was clear that she wasn't happy with Fuyan for gossiping. Fuyan also knew that third young madam was angry, so she immediately lowered her head and kept silent. It didn't matter if Fuyan gossiped about these matters within the confines of Songtao Court. However, if this were to spread out of their courtyard, then others would be able to reprimand her for not managing her servants properly. Furthermore, careless talk invites disaster. Being talkative wasn't necessarily a good thing, especially when it was one of her personal handmaids. Actually, she had already guessed why Matriarch He and Countess Jing'an had kept the main branch behind just now. This was something that was supposed to have happened earlier. It was only because she had interfered with Madame Zhu's fate and saved her from that kitchen fire that this matter had been delayed. She had thought that this event wouldn't happen now that Madame Zhu was hale and hearty. However, who could have known that some things would still run their course? Just as Rome wasn't built in a day, the trouble broiling in the main branch hadn't suddenly come into existence with her arrival. Chu Lian sighed. Now that things had progressed to this stage, it was already out of her hands. Chapter 265, Taking a Concubine, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. At this time, He Daling had just walked out of Countess Jing'an's courtyard. However, it wasn't just him and his wife now. A young lady was following behind them with her head lowered and a blush on her cheeks. This lady was Countess Jing'an's handmaid, Miaozhen. Miaozhen was no longer Countess Jing'an's handmaid, and was now Dalang's bed servant, essentially, a concubine. This was something that Matriarch He had personally decided. The matriarch had even ordered He Dalang to consummate their relationship this very night. He Changqi had a cold expression on his face now. His looks had taken after Count Jing'an a square face and a tall, strong body with tanned skin. When he put on such an expression, it was hard for others to get close to him. Right behind He Changqi was the pale Madame Zhu. Halfway back to their courtyard, she wanted to tug at her husband's sleeve. However, even though she reached out a few times, she couldn't bear to lower her dignity to do it in the end. By the time they reached home, the couple still hadn't exchanged a single word. Matriarch His senior servant Liu was following behind the couple. She observed the couple indifferently before shifting her gaze away, remaining silent as well. When they reached the parlor, instead of trying to plead with He Changqi, she simply continued standing there with a ghastly pale face. This action made He Changqi press his lips together in empty disappointment. Even senior servant Liu, who was not far behind, shook her head secretly. Madame Zhu was just too much of a failure as a wife. When the steadfast loyalty of her relationship with her husband was being tested, she was still unwilling to lower her head and only tried to keep up a strong and haughty pretense. What sort of result could that action get her? Senior servant Liu hadn't spoken at all on the way here in order to give Dalang and his wife a chance. This was also something that Matriarch He had instructed her to do in secret. Unfortunately, Madame Zhu hadn't been able to grasp this chance. In the parlor of their courtyard, husband and wife kept silent and waged a cold war with each other. He Changqi was originally a more traditional kind of person. How could he lower himself to coax his wife? Thus, the Cold War brewed even fiercer. Finally, Senior servant Liu had to step up to break this stalemate. Eldest young madam, it's getting late. You've been busy the whole day, so why don't you rest a little earlier? This old servant will help arrange matters for Heir Jing'an. Although senior servant Liu spoke politely, it was clear in her tone that she wasn't going to accept any refusal. Frustration had been brewing in Madame Zhu's belly for a long time. Senior servant Liu's words were like the spark to light the fuse. While in front of her mother-in-law, Countess Jing'an, she had to control herself and suppress her emotions, but now that it was just an old servant in front of her, she could no longer continue holding herself back. Madame Zhu abruptly stood up and pushed senior servant Liu with a burst of strength that had come out of nowhere. You old servant. What are you? When has it been up to you to dictate matters in our branch? How could senior servant Liu have expected the normally dignified Madame Zhu to have lost her temper? What's more, she was acting like an immoral and unreasonable shrew. After getting pushed by Madame Zhu, senior servant Liu lost her balance and fell right onto the floor on her behind. Senior servant Liu was no longer young. How could her body bear such a fall? She cried out in pain, unable to get up. It was only when Madame Zhu noticed the extremely pained expression on the servant's face that she realized what she had done. She froze on the spot, not knowing what to do. Changqi's eyes widened in shock. By the time he could finally react, he was about to try catching senior servant Liu, but she had already fallen to the ground. He strode over quickly and asked, Momo, are you all right? Changqi had already been angry with Madame Zhu. Now that he had watched her personally push down his grandmother's trusted old servant, he was beside himself with rage. He glared fiercely at Madame Zhu and shouted, Madame Zhu, look at what you've done. Calling you a shrew would be letting you off lightly. Madame Zhu had already been frightened by this turn of events. Now that her husband was shouting at her, she immediately switched gears. Changqi, who are you calling a shrew? I'm talking about you. Good, very good. Changqi, you traitor, you bastard. How dare you scold me like that? How could Madame Zhu bear with such insult? Furthermore, this was someone she had walked hand in hand with for close to 10 years. Her rage turned her face white, her chest heaved as she swept everything off the nearby table. Clatter, crash, went the porcelain teapots and cups as they met with the floor. That wasn't enough to quell her rage, so she picked up a cup that had been spared from the carnage and threw it at Changqi. Changqi stood there without dodging it, glaring at her with an icy expression. Thus, the cup smashed against the corner of Changqi's forehead. In the next second, crimson blood dripped down from the cut, dyeing half of his face red. TL note: in ancient China, there were different levels of concubines. The normal concubine is usually seen as half-wife and half-servant and may even take up the role of lady in charge of the household if there is no wife present. Meanwhile, men can take maidservants, sometimes their wives' very own handmaids, into their harem as bedservants, who are usually seen as just servants. Bed servants might even be able to rise to the rank of a normal concubine if they gave birth to sons. Children born from these concubines or bed servants were all seen as illegitimate, and only children born from lawfully wedded wives were seen as legitimate. There is also another rule, which can be broken, that men cannot take concubines until they have a legitimate wife, or they might be seen as crooked and not very ideal as husbands. The exception to this is taking a bed servant, usually a handmaid bestowed by their mothers who is meant to educate them on knightly duties. Hopefully this helps to explain some of the inner tensions and reactions of the noble families, as well as why matriarch He and Countess Jing'an seem so blasé about giving He Dalang a bed servant. A bed servant would hardly take the place of Madame Zhu and might even help with giving birth to a son for Dalang, so there's no threat to Madame Zhu. As a virtuous wife, she is also expected to accept her husband's expanding harem. Chapter 266. Found him. 1. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. One of the more quick-witted maidservants quietly retreated upon seeing this turn of events and rushed off to report to the matriarch. Not too far off, the waiting Miaozhen had suffered a fright. Eldest young madam had actually hit the air. By the time she regained her senses, she quickly ran over to Changqi's side and pulled out a handkerchief to cover the wound on his forehead. Her voice was choked up with anxiety as she said, Jingen, you've been hurt. Quick, we have to call the imperial physicians. Madame Zhu froze upon seeing the blood on He Changqi's face, her wits completely gone. However, upon seeing that slut Miaozhen still trying to spoil the relationship between her and her husband at a time like this, her quelled rage reignited once again. She lost all semblance of rationality as her eyes reddened due to her anger and fury within. You little bitch! How dare you speak in front of me? Right after Madame Zhu shouted, she bent down and picked up one of the porcelain shards on the ground, intending to throw it at Miaozhen. Having seen what had happened to He Changqi, Madame Zhu's maidservants reacted much faster this time and quickly ran up to stop her. Madame Zhu's trusted senior servant cried out, My eldest young madam, please stop acting so rashly. He Changqi stared Madame Zhu straight in the eyes with a cold glare as icy as the tundra. He reached out and pulled Miaozhen behind him, shielding her. His tone was colder than ever as he told his wife, Madame Zhu, I want to see how far you're going to take this madness today. After the maidservants took the porcelain shard from Madame Zhu's hands, she looked up only to see her normally loving husband staring at her with cold eyes. When she saw that He Changqi was actually protecting another woman behind him, the final string in her mind snapped. She screamed shrilly like a mad harpy and charged towards He Changqi recklessly, already beyond caring. He Changqi ignored the fresh blood flowing down from his forehead and continued watching Madame Zhu descend into madness with half of his stony face covered in blood. He couldn't get his mind around how his warm and caring wife had suddenly turned into this person he didn't recognize at all. For so many years, he could swear on his conscience that he hadn't mistreated Madame Zhu in any manner. The He family's rules were strict and he hadn't taken any concubines. Furthermore, he hadn't fooled around with other women outside the estate, either. Even when out with his friends, he always drew the line. Although he and Madame Zhu still hadn't been able to get a son, they had everything else together. He had never pushed Madame Zhu on the matter of carrying on the next generation. He had also secretly considered what to do if he never had any sons in his life. Since he still had 2 brothers down the line, it wasn't necessarily just up to him to carry on the family line. As long as he and his wife remained harmonious, grandmother wouldn't say anything more. However, before he had been able to tell all this to Madame Zhu, she had somehow changed. He Dalang's heart instantly turned as desolate as the wild plains of Liangju. The image of his brilliant and virtuous wife seemed to have abruptly shattered and vanished into nothing. Madame Zhu put up a wild struggle against the people holding her back. Upon managing to break free, she pushed the maidservants aside and charged towards He Changqi with a deranged look on her face, shouting, You little slut! How dare you seduce the heir? I'll teach you a lesson right now. However, before Madame Zhu could even touch the corner of Miaozhen's dress, a clear smack echoed throughout the room. Madame Zhu felt an intense pain in her cheek. In the next second, her body fell to the ground against her will. When Chu Lian helped Matriarch He in, it was just in time to see He Dalang slap Madame Zhu on the face without any bit of mercy. Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes widened in absolute shock. In the next moment, she caught sight of He Changqi's half-bloody face and suffered another shock once again. What was going on? How had things gotten to this state in less than an hour? Madame Zhu had also been stunned by He Changqi's merciless slap. She was sprawled on the ground, one hand held up to her swollen left cheek, while she looked up in disbelief at He Changqi. As if her heart was about to break, she cried, He Changqi, you actually hit me. By this time, Matriarch His sharp old eyes were lit up with rage, especially after she spotted senior servant Liu still paralyzed and lying on the ground. She paused where she stood, only to tighten her grip around her vermilion bird-head cane and slam the end of it down onto the marble tiles with a clear thunk. All of you, stop right now. Are you trying to start a rebellion here? Matriarch His tone was full of dignity. Right after she spoke, the family guards that the main steward had sent from the outer court separated Madame Zhu and He Changqi. On the other side, some maidservants carried the injured senior servant Liu off to a side room. There were also servants who immediately started tidying up the mess in the parlor. Perhaps Matriarch His angry shout had come to some use, as Madame Zhu finally regained some of her rationality. Her eyes were fixed on that slut Miaozhen as she helped Changqi to a chair and then helped the doctor with cleaning up the wound on his forehead. The corner of Madame Zhu's lips tugged downwards, but in the end, she wasn't able to say a word. Now that the situation was under control, Chu Lian helped Matriarch He to the main seat in the parlor. Once the matriarch was seated with her hands on her cane, she shouted once again with a stony expression, "All of you in the main branch, kneel down right now." Chu Lian glanced at the enraged matriarch He next to her before secretly glancing at her brother-in-law and sister-in-law in front of her, about to kneel down with the support of the servants around them. She quickly whispered into matriarch His ear. Following that, Chu Lian led the servants she had brought with her out of the parlor to check on senior servant Liu, who was being treated by a doctor in one of the side rooms. Matriarch He was about to reprimand the main branch. As the most junior family member present, she would have only earned her brother-in-law and sister-in-law's ire if she were to witness such a humiliating scene. Chapter 267, Found Him, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian watched over senior servant Liu in the side room while waiting for movement from the parlor. Luckily, senior servant Liu's body was still rather robust, so she had only broken a bone from this fall. She would be completely fine after lying in bed and resting for 3 to 4 months. It was only about an hour later that someone came over from the parlor to report. When Chu Lian finished listening to the report, she quickly got up to return to the parlor. As she held on to matriarch His arm to support her as they left the main branch's courtyard, Chu Lian turned back to look through the parlor's open doors. The master and mistress of the main branch were still kneeling in the center of the parlor, their backs ramrod straight. However, husband and wife were now like strangers, ignoring each other. After sending matriarch He back to Qingxi Hall, it was clear that the matriarch was worn out. Before she left, the matriarch didn't forget to remind her not to speak of the matter, and especially not to let Countess Jing'an find out. Chu Lian nodded in agreement. She sent the matriarch all the way to her bedroom before returning to Songtao Court. The next day, Madame Zhu had been grounded by matriarch He. She heard that Changqi had already consummated his relationship with Miaozhen last night and that Miaozhen had settled into Changqi's study. Due to various reasons and circumstances, Daling had still taken a concubine before he had hit 30 years of age. However, when the servants talked about it in private, they would say that the heir had merely accepted a bed servant. A bed servant couldn't be counted as a concubine, so he hadn't broken the He family's rules. After all, it was his wife who hadn't been able to give birth to a male heir after 10 years. Since Madame Zhu had been grounded by matriarch He for half a month, the management of the estate fell to matriarch He instead. In the past few days, whenever Chu Lian made her morning visits to Qingxi Hall, she would be held back by the matriarch for quite some time, either getting forced to go over some of the estate's account books or to watch the matriarch handle various matters of the estate. If not for Chu Lian being a bag of lazy bones who didn't want to take over the management of the estate, matriarch He would have probably let her temporarily replace Madame Zhu as the lady in charge. In the blink of an eye, it was already mid-October. These days, Chu Lian didn't leave the estate at all in order to avoid the inescapable pest, Xiaobo Jian. During this time, Royal Princess Duanjia only visited her once to pass on some gifts from Princess Wei. Before she left, Chu Lian accompanied Royal Princess Duanjia on a walk around her own courtyard. They had even gone to the study in the outer court, but Royal Princess Duanjia's expression still remained unhappy for some reason. Chu Lian had too many things on her plate, so she didn't delve deeper into the matter. She and Royal Princess Duanjia also discussed opening a jewelry store together. This time, with Prince Wei's estate taking the lead, she wouldn't have to worry about much. Everything would be left up to Princess Wei's people to arrange. All she had to do was contribute her part to it, designing some new accessories every month. Currently, Chu Lian was lying on the wooden lounge chair by the window in her room. She had a book in one hand, but she had been stuck on the same page for quite a while. If they went by the novel's original plot, then the final imperial examination would be held in the upcoming days. Xiaobo Jian's name would most likely spread throughout the whole capital by then, because he would become the top scholar of the year. It would also signify the start of the war, The two Huns were going to gather up an army to invade Liangju after years of peace in the north. The novel had simply given this event a small mention in the story. Chu Lian didn't know what the exact details were like. She only knew that it was a hard-won war and that there had been many casualties in the northern border troops. Now that her crazy husband He Sanlang was there in the north, was he going to be safe? Chu Lian sighed. Even though her aim had always been to be a happy layabouts, she didn't know why she was actually feeling a little worried. While Chu Lian's thoughts were a mess, Xian's joyful voice rang out from the outer room. "Third young madam, some news came from Guilin restaurant." Chu Lian set down the book in her heads and turned to look. Xian was usually very calm and steady. Why was she suddenly getting so excited? Had something good happened? When she heard Xian mention Guilin restaurant, a single thought appeared in Chu Lian's mind. Had they found that person? Without waiting for Xian to come over to her, Chu Lian pushed herself up using the armrests and cried out in surprise, "Have they found the person who can answer all three questions?" Xian was smiling so widely that her eyes had turned to crescents. "Indeed they have, third young madam. Right after they found him, Manager Qin sent someone over to the estate to report it. He said that that person's currently eating in one of Guilin restaurant's private rooms together with an elderly man." Chu Lian hurriedly got up, not even caring that one of the embroidered shoes on her feet had dropped off. She ran to her closet with one foot clad in only silken socks. "Quick, help me change. Tell Wenlan to prepare the carriage in the outer court first. I have to go to Guilin restaurant right now. Oh, right, get senior servant Zhong to bring out one of the jars of grape wine I brewed recently. And don't forget to send someone to notify grandmother that I'm going out." Chu Lian was completely flustered. That person was Great Dr. Miao. She had actually found him. Chapter 268, The Great Doctor Shows His Skill. 1. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. When Chu Lian finally reached Guilin restaurant, Manager Qin personally guided her to a private room where the person she was looking for was waiting. The moment Chu Lian entered the room, she could hear people talking behind the screen placed in front of the entrance. "Brother Miao, if not for you, we would have had to wait a whole month to eat in this Guilin restaurant." "Oh, this Guilin restaurant is that popular?" "Brother Miao, you've just arrived here so you wouldn't know about this, but the owner of this Guilin restaurant is the very, very wise." Immediately after, a deep chuckle resounded. As smart as this owner is, how could they compare to Brother Wang? Duran Restaurant's Mr. Wang burst out into laughter. "I can't live up to that boast. Honored Lady Jeannie and I can't be compared on the same level. Her business skill is so much better than mine. Can you guess how long it took for Guilin Restaurant to become this popular in the capital? A month, maybe 2? Surely you're not going to tell me that it only took 10 days. Old Wang, even if you like to exaggerate your stories, that's just too unbelievable. There's always a certain order to things. When you brought me here, it was obvious to me that this old alleyway isn't a good location for a restaurant." Mr. Wang shook his head and grinned. He lifted one finger for the man sitting across from him, happy that he had finally found something that could shock his old friend. "Mph, I'm going to tell you. Brother Miao, it only took a single day for this restaurant to become known across the entire capital." Great Dr. Miao was in the middle of picking up some pork slices in mashed garlic. When he heard his old friend's words, his eyes almost popped out of his head. "Brother Wang, you're not pulling my leg, are you?" Mr. Wang cast a sideways look at his old friend with sharp eyes. If you don't believe me, you can ask honored Lady Jeannie herself when she comes." "You're saying that the owner of this restaurant will be coming to look for us?" Mr. Wang really didn't know what to do with this innocent, naive old friend of his. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Since his old friend was the only one who could answer Guilin Restaurant's 3 questions, what did that mean? Those questions had been specially prepared for Great Dr. Miao. They had been put up just to lure this big fish into their net. Someone had likely reported this news to honored Lady Jeannie. In a short moment, he would finally be able to meet the owner of this Guilin restaurant. Chu Lian took in a deep breath to suppress the excitement in her heart and made sure she had a normal expression in place before stepping around the screen. Once she passed the screen, she could see two men sitting across from each other as they ate and drank. Chu Lian bobbed in greeting towards the two men before taking a seat at the same table facing the window. Manager Qin personally guarded the private room from outside. An hour later, Chu Lian brought her maidservants out with her as she exited the room. Manager Qin fell into step behind her and carefully asked, "Third young madam, was it successful?" Chu Lian had lost control of her emotions. Her good cheer was written all over her face. To Manager Qin, she nodded and instructed, "Let Mr. Miao stay in Dark Court 1 over the next few days. In 7 days, pick someone you trust and bring Mr. Miao to the Jing'an estate." After she finished giving Manager Qin his orders, she returned to the Jing'an estate. The novel was right. Great Dr. Miao was an absolute foodie. With those questions as bait, and after offering up the grape wine she had personally brewed, Great Dr. Miao had come to an agreement with her and agreed to go to the Jing'an estate in 7 days to check Countess Jing'an's illness. However, one of the conditions was that Chu Lian had to personally cook a dish he hadn't tried at Guilin restaurant. This condition was an easy one for Chu Lian, so she agreed to it without hesitation. On the way back to the Jing'an estate, Chu Lian had already thought of what to make, the crispy roast duck that royal Princess Duanjia kept talking about. House Jing'an's carriage was driving down a spacious green cobblestone street when a black horse galloping at full speed approached the carriage from the front. At a glance, it could be seen that the black horse wasn't just any common steed off the street. The manservant driving the carriage was worried that they might get into an accident, so he nudged the carriage horses to the side of the road while cutting their speed drastically, doing his best to give the galloping horse as much space as he could. However, the rider of that galloping horse didn't seem to notice that gesture at all. Conversely, he stuck to his own path and even moved closer to the carriage. Without waiting for House Jing'an's manservant to react, the black horse crossed paths with Chu Lian's carriage with just a hair's breadth between them, and then disappeared at the end of the street. As the horse sprinted past, the gust of wind it left in its wake parted the curtains covering the window of Chu Lian's carriage. Chu Lian could only hear the thundering hoofbeats pass by a little too close for comfort. She was about to ask the guards outside what was happening when she saw that a thin bamboo tube had been thrown into the carriage. It had rolled onto the carpet right in front of her. Any words she had to say were stuck in the back of her throat as her gaze slowly shifted to the thin bamboo tube. The special pattern on it was all too familiar to her. It was the exact same pattern as the one on the capsule she had found in the orange at the Zheng estate when she had requested for fresh oranges. The capsule back then, however, had been slightly more fine. Xian was sitting with her inside the carriage. When she saw the bamboo tube as well, she suffered a huge fright. Her head was also lowered as she stared at that little bamboo tube on the carpeted floor of the carriage. Fear filled her heart. If it hadn't been a simple bamboo tube, but instead some hidden weapon, then her master would probably be injured right now. Xian was about to speak up to ask a question when Chu Lian tugged at her sleeve and shook her head, her eyebrows furrowed. Xian then quickly covered her own mouth and nodded a few times at Chu Lian, indicating that she wasn't going to say anything. By this time, one of the guards escorting the carriage from outside had come over to the window. He asked in a worried tone, "Third young madam, are you all right?" Chu Lian quickly tried to regain her composure and make her voice sound normal before answering, "Yes, I'm fine." "Why? Has something happened outside?" Hearing her calm tone, the guard relaxed. "It's nothing, it was just a galloping horse passing by. Third young madam, if you need anything, please call for this subordinate." After waiting for a moment and ensuring that there were no other sounds outside the carriage, Chu Lian reached out to pick up the bamboo tube. With the tube in her hands, she waited yet another moment before taking in a deep breath and opening it up. TL note: the pork slices in mashed garlic look so good. I can almost taste the yummy garlic. I found a recipe in English if anyone's interested in trying it out. https://www. China Sichuan food. Pork slice in mashed garlic. Also, someone asked for a glossary of all the foods that have appeared in TMR so far. Would anyone be willing to help collate them? I can link to it in the table of contents if you do. 3 pork slices in minced garlic alternate version with chili sauce. Chapter 269, The Great Doctor Shows His Skill. 2. this chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. There was a rolled-up piece of paper inside the bamboo tube. She gently smoothed out the paper and read the 2 lines of words written in the Shojin style. Xiao Bojian's writing was completely different from He Changdi's. He Changdi's words were usually written in bold and powerful strokes, lending a somewhat grand air to them. Xiao Bojian wrote with such force that his words could be seen from the back of the paper, but they were neat and almost mechanical. It was rare to see any words touching. You could tell what a person was like through their handwriting. However, just looking at this meticulous handwriting, it was likely that no one would be able to discern the well-hidden greed and ambition within Xiao Bojian. Anything could be faked. What the naked eye could see, what was shown on people's faces, all of it could be used to deceive others. Xian's eyes were fixed on her master. When she saw that Chu Lian's brows were drawn together and her expression didn't seem too good, she tried asking, "Third young madam, is anything the matter?" Chu Lian returned to reality and directly passed the note over to Xian without any intention of concealing its contents. Xian took the note and glanced over it. There wasn't much to read, but the gist of the message was that they were requesting to meet with her master half a month later. Xiao Bojian had successfully become the top scholar in the final imperial examination, and old Duqing had been his mentor. He would hold a banquet of gratitude for his mentor in the Ying estate then. Xiao Bojian was hinting that Chu Lian should use this chance to return to her maiden house. Xian looked at Chu Lian worriedly and bit her lip in unease. "Third young madam, do you want to go?" Chu Lian returned Xian's stare for a long while before asking, "Xian, do you think that I'll be going?" Xian cast her gaze downwards, not daring to look at Chu Lian. Quite some time passed before she finally managed to squeeze out the words, "Mr. Xiao's status is no longer as ordinary as before," Chu Lian sneered. No longer ordinary? He was just a measly top scholar. Even if he had a mysterious organization in his hands, so what? She, Chu Lian, wasn't one to follow someone else's bidding. Chu Lian took the paper note from Xian's hands and tore it to shreds before throwing it into her hand warmer and turning it into ashes. The specially carved bamboo tube was also thrown out of the carriage. Xian's eyes widened as she watched Chu Lian's actions. "Third young madam, you're not going. Even if he becomes a first-ranked official, that has nothing to do with me. I'm the third young madam of House Jing'an now, and I'm no longer that helpless, powerless sixth miss of House Ying." There were plenty of people willing to protect her now. Xian was struck into a daze. When she finally recovered, she smiled sweetly despite the tears in her eyes. Chu Lian was helpless before this silly handmaid of hers. "What are you crying for, you little?" Xian quickly wiped at her eyes with her handkerchief, her smile still shining brightly underneath her tear-stained cheeks. "Third young madam, this servant isn't crying, this servant is happy." She was really happy. Compared to the past sixth Miss Chu, she liked the current third young madam of House Jing'an more. It was great that third young madam could think so clearly. When the carriage reached the Jing'an estate, master and servant both treated that bamboo tube as if it had never existed. Chu Lian continued passing her days lazily. She didn't think that Xiao Bojian would send someone to kidnap her if she didn't go to the Ying estate. Xiao Bojian wasn't that bold yet. 7 days later, Great Dr. Miao was personally escorted to the Jing'an estate by Manager Qin. Chu Lian had also notified Matriarch He of this visit beforehand. Today, Chu Lian had invited Royal Princess Duanjia over. Since this matter involved Countess Jing'an's health, He Erlang had also rushed back to the estate despite his busy schedule. The Dragon Guards had been given a mission and He Chongjue was to be posted to the neighboring city of Zhongju the day after tomorrow. He was also taking this chance to return to the estate and bid his farewells to his family. 3 days later, he would be departing the estate to meet his commanding officer at the west gate of the capital and set off for Zhongju. Chu Lian personally made roast duck for the foodie Great Dr. Miao. When Great Dr. Miao came out from Countess Jing'an's bedroom, even the normally calm Chu Lian was so anxious that she quickly stood up to welcome him. "Mr. Miao, how is mother's illness? Can it be treated?" Great Dr. Miao nodded confidently. "Honored lady, please rest assured. Madam's condition isn't that severe, and I can cure it once and for all. However, There's something I have to tell honored lady beforehand. Matriarch, he was seated at the head of the room. When she heard those words, it was as if a burden that she had carried for years had suddenly lifted. Her expression seemed relaxed as she said, "Mr. Meow, please feel free to speak. We'll do anything as long as it's something within our ability." Great Dr. Meow stroked his beard as he said, "Well, this matter could be easy or difficult, depending on the circumstances." Chu Lian earnestly listened, not willing to miss a single word he said. TL note: Shojin-style calligraphy is literally thin golden style and is appropriately named XD Shojin style, from Wikipedia. Chapter 270, War at the Northern Border, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. If you want to cure Madam's illness once and for all, you need a single medicinal ingredient. However, this ingredient only grows in the high mountains of the extreme north. The medicinal ingredient that Great Dr. Meow needed was a type of alpine flower. It was also one of the rarest alpine flowers and was called snow mountain mists. It grew only on the peaks of snow-capped mountains and would only bloom at the coldest times of the year. After blooming, it would wither away in just 2 to 3 days. To be able to use it in medicine, the flower had to be picked right before it withered, otherwise it would lose all its worth as a medicinal ingredient. It was known to grow in the border between the Great Wu dynasty and the Tuhuns territory Mount Arming. In another 3 months, it would be time for the snow mountain mists on Mount Arming to bloom. This rare ingredient was hard to preserve and there weren't many fields that required the use of it. Most doctors didn't even know of the medicinal uses of this flower, so it was impossible to find it on the market. Even Great Dr. Meow had only incidentally found out about its uses during his younger days when he had wandered all over the land. Great Dr. Meow spoke bluntly to the various members of the He family gathered in the parlor. The treatment for Countess Jingen's body couldn't be delayed for too long. Even if he personally helped stabilize her condition, she could only go on like that for another 2 years. If they couldn't find this snow mountain mist's flower within 2 years, then there would be nothing he could do. After Great Dr. Meow finished explaining the situation, he left the parlor to write a prescription for Countess Jingen. Only Matriarch He, the eldest son He Changqi, the second son He Changjue, and the newlywed wife of the third son, Chu Lian, were left in the parlor. The joy that had been present on their faces earlier had disappeared. The matriarch's expression was so serious that the wrinkles on her face creased further. When Chu Lian noticed this, her heart ached for the matriarch. She tried to reassure the old lady by saying, "Grandmother, at least there's some hope for mother now. And it's not as if this type of flower is completely unheard of. Having some hope is better than having none at all, isn't it?" Matriarch He took in a deep breath and patted Chu Lian's hand. "You're right, Liana. At least there's some hope for your mother's illness now. I should be happy instead." Silence reigned in the parlor for a while more before He Erlang abruptly stepped forward and knelt before Matriarch He. In a firm voice, he said, "Grandmother, let me go to the north to search for this flower for mother." Right after He Erlang spoke, He Daling also knelt down in front of Matriarch He. "Grandmother, don't let Erlang go. Erlang hasn't even gotten married yet. I'm the eldest son of this family. When father left to protect the border, he instructed me to take care of grandmother, mother, and my 2 younger brothers. It's obviously me who should go on this trip to the north." "No, eldest brother, I'll go." "Second brother, are you going to disobey your older brother? Let me go." The normally harmonious brothers were actually fighting to be the one to go to the northern border. Matriarch He was starting to get a headache from their quarreling. She slapped the table next to her with a loud bang and said, "Enough. What are you fighting for?" It was only then that the 2 brothers stopped and quieted down. However, none of them stood up and they simply waited for Matriarch His final verdict. Matriarch He massaged her forehead. After a short pause, she heaved a sigh and said, "This old woman knows that you're all filial children. However, Dalang, you hold a position at court. Without the Emperor's permission, you can't abandon your post without a proper reason. Our estate needs you here as well. We can't do without a male master here to hold the fort in such a big estate. And Erlang has just gotten a mission in Zhongju. I heard this mission was ordered by the Emperor himself. You can't disobey imperial orders. If you go to the northern border at this time, are you going to willingly deceive the emperor? So neither of you are allowed to go. What? Neither of them were allowed to go. But they were the only male members of House Jingen left in the capital. If neither of them were to go, how could they stop worrying? It was their very own mother who was severely ill. Grandmother, you can't. If we don't go, what's going to happen to mother? He Dalang and he Erlang asked in unison. Matriarch he opened her mouth to speak. She had a troubled expression on her face. Count Jingen was deeply in love with his wife. If he were to find out about this piece of good news, he would never let the chance go. She also felt very guilty towards this daughter-in-law of hers, and wished for her speedy recovery. Chu Lian pressed her lips before reminding all of them, Grandmother, have you all forgotten about husband? Why don't you ask husband to send someone to Mount Arming to investigate? With husband around, he'll surely get the job done. Matriarch he froze for an instant. She looked at Chu Lian before turning to the two grandsons kneeling before her. She felt that Chu Lian had brought up a good suggestion. After thinking it over, she declared, even if you want to go to the northern border, you won't be able to set out in just 1 or 2 days. There are too many things to prepare for in the estate. I have to think about it carefully. Liana is right, we still have Sanlang at the northern border, so the two of you shouldn't worry too much. Especially you, Erlang. You can't fool around with an imperial mission on your shoulders. Pack up and go back to the left military guards today. He Chungjua wanted to protest, but after getting glared at by He Dalang, he could only lower his head and agree to it. Chu Lian escorted Matriarch He back to Qingxi Hall before returning to her own courtyard. TL note, yes, our adorable author Snow Mountain Mists did a self-insert, and added herself as a medicinal ingredient in the story XD. Chapter 271, War at the Northern Border, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. Great Dr. Miao had been invited to stay longer in the Jingen estate, and his daily meals were now the responsibility of the kitchen in Chu Lian's courtyard. Great Dr. Miao was an amiable guest as long as he had some delicious food before him, so he settled in rather peacefully. 3 days later, House Ying sent Matriarch He an invite for Xiaobo Jian's thank you banquet for his mentor. They specially invited both the matriarch and honored Lady Jeannie. As matriarch he held the invitation in her hands and wondered how she should reply. Chu Lian's father, Chu Chizheng, had also sent an invite over. It was delivered straight to Chu Lian. Chu Lian didn't know that matriarch he had been invited as well. Her brows furrowed when she received the invitation from her father. Xiaobo Jian seemed to have anticipated her reluctance to attend the banquet and had purposely gotten her father to send her an invite. What was he trying to do? Chu Lian's mood remained agitated until late afternoon, when she brought the invite to Qingxi Hall to discuss the matter with Matriarch He. Just as grandmother and granddaughter had settled down in the parlor of Qingxi Hall, they could hear some noise coming from outside. Matriarch He hadn't been in a good mood in the first place. When she heard the disturbance, her expression turned grave. Muxiang, go outside and find out what's going on. In a short moment, Muxiang returned. Her face was full of anxiety as she ran back in without minding her usual etiquette. She hurriedly reported, Matriarch, the person causing the disturbance outside is a guard from Prince Jin's estate. He said that there's something urgent to report to Matriarch. This servant accidentally overheard a part of it. War has broken out at the northern border. What? Matriarch He abruptly stood up in shock. Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes had also widened in surprise. However, she had already been mentally prepared for this piece of news, so her reaction was much calmer than Matriarch His. The news was too much for Matriarch He. Her body wavered before she completely lost her strength and almost fell forward. Luckily, Chu Lian spotted this in time and quickly caught hold of Matriarch He. The maidservants nearby also hurriedly stepped forward to support the matriarch. Grandmother, are you all right? Are you feeling unwell anywhere? Matriarch He leaned on Chu Lian's shoulder as she massaged the bridge of her nose. After a long moment, she seemed to have finally recovered some of her spirit. She slowly opened her eyes. I'm all right now. Quick, Let the messenger in. Mu Xiang rushed out to call the messenger. Chu Lian helped Matriarch He to her seat once again. Scared for the matriarch's health, she told Wenlan to request Great Dr. Miao's presence. The worn-looking man was escorted in by the main steward of the outer court. It was only after the messenger showed his token that Matriarch He finally believed that this man was from Prince Jin's estate. "Tell me, what's happening at the northern border?" Matriarch His voice was hoarse and carried a heavy sense of fatigue. The messenger bowed before he started his report. The Tuhun army has gathered outside Liangju. The northern border troops have already skirmished with them a few times. Great General Qian is currently leading the northern border troops and doing his best to defend against the Tuhuns. However, the weather is getting worse over there and Liangju city is seeing heavy snowfall. The only worry is that the heavy snow might close up the mountain pass and block the supply line. When two armies are at war, their biggest worry is running out of supplies. The Tuhuns had bided their time for over a decade. It was likely that they had already sussed out the supply times of the northern border troops and had specially chosen this period to mount a surprise attack. Matriarch He and Chu Lian both gasped upon hearing this news. Once their supplies ran out, the whole army would likely starve to death before the Tuhuns took action. This wasn't a warm spring day they were facing. The winter over there could even kill the hardy, frost-resistant yaks. Matriarch He felt her body turn to jelly. She turned an affectionate yet pitiful gaze upon the young granddaughter-in-law next to her. The words she wanted to say refused to come out of her throat. After a short moment, Matriarch He seemed to have rediscovered her voice. "All right, I've received your report. You can go back now. If there's any news, please ask Prince Jin to inform us." The guard who had played messenger bowed once again before quickly departing. The atmosphere inside the parlor was heavy. It was only after a long period of time had passed that Matriarch He finally spoke up again. "Liana, it's been hard on you." Chu Lian paused for a moment in surprise before reaching out to grasp Matriarch His wrinkled hand. She shook her head gently and said, "Grandmother, please don't say that. When husband went off to the northern border, no one could have expected those Tuhuns to start acting again after so many years of peace. As the saying goes, danger opens the door of opportunity. Maybe this Tuhun attack might be a good chance for husband. It's useless for us to keep worrying here in the estate. Why don't we invite eldest brother here to discuss this matter? Eldest brother has many connections, so he might be able to look for more news." Matriarch He was getting old after all. Even though she was still wise, her mind wasn't as quick as it had been. Upon hearing Chu Lian's reminder, it was like a light went off in her head. She quickly ordered someone to summon He Daling back to the estate. He Changqi's many connections did come to use. He quickly gathered some news using various channels. War had indeed broken out at the northern border. Furthermore, it was snowing heavily in Liangju city now. Although the court wanted to send in relief, they were held up by the snows at the foot of the Qin Mountains. The reinforcements and supplies weren't able to pass. The alternate path was to go through Chongju Prefecture and go down the Li River to reach Su City. Beyond Su City was Lake Qianshan. However, by this time, the lake had already frozen over and they couldn't sail across at all. With all the roads to the northern border closed, the officials at court were at a loss for what to do. They could only watch the situation get increasingly worse. Right at this time, the news of a major case of embezzlement in the neighboring city of Zhongju spread throughout the capital. As part of the Dragon Guards, He Erlang was assisting with the case, so he probably wouldn't be able to return for another month. Prince Jin sent news about Liangju every day. Meanwhile, Matriarch He was looking more and more frail as the days passed. Countess Jingen, whose health had just taken a turn for the better, inadvertently overheard the servants talking about the war in Liangju and immediately fainted right over, becoming bedridden once more. This winter, the whole of House Jingen seemed to be on the verge of collapse, as if it would just vanish to the whims of time on the next tick of a second. Chapter 272, Preparations, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. On the night that Chu Lian had found out that war had broken out in the northern border, she couldn't fall asleep until midnight, even though she usually liked to go to bed early and get her beauty sleep. Chu Lian tossed and turned on her bed. The drowsiness that had plagued her earlier had all but disappeared, and she couldn't summon it back no matter what she tried. In the end, Chu Lian could only lie flat on her back underneath her warm blankets, staring up at the canopy of her bed shrouded in darkness. Although she had read the original book, so many things had changed by now. And even if the events had somehow miraculously stayed the same, it wasn't like the book had described every single matter in great detail, either. Take, for example, the battle going on at the northern border. Chu Lian only knew that an event like that would happen. She didn't know whether they were going to win or lose in the end, let alone how they might have won. Although she wanted to be a carefree layaboutte who just cooked good food and earned money all day, the prerequisite for this was that House Jingen had to be doing well. If House Jingen was in a precarious situation, then this title of third young madam would turn to nothing. Furthermore, she loved the family she had in the Jingen estate very much, with the exception of Madame Zhu. She didn't want to see them sad or grieving, nor did she want to see them individually sacrifice themselves for the family. Chu Lian closed her eyes, on the brink of making a decision that would determine the fate of her family. When her almond-shaped eyes reopened, it was as if the entire universe was reflected in them, even in the midst of absolute darkness. All this time, she had been living happily under the protection of her senior family members. Now that it was time for her to carry her part of the family burdens, she wasn't going to shy away. After she had finished thinking things through, Chu Lian stopped tossing and turning. Her eyes slid shut and her breathing turned long, and even in just a short moment. Xian was on night duty today and waiting in the side room just outside Chu Lian's bedroom. When she could no longer hear any noises from within, she settled down to rest for the night in relief. The next day, the lazybones Chu Lian actually managed to get up by herself without waiting for the maidservants to wake her. When senior servant Zhong entered the bedroom, she saw that Chu Lian had changed into a pink tunic suited for physical exercise, while her soft, dark hair had been tied up into a high ponytail that went all the way down to her waist. Senior servant Zhong gaped. She had to calm herself down for some time before she finally found her voice again. "Third young madam, why are you dressed like that?" Chu Lian tidied up her hair a little, swung her arms and legs around and then pulled on some riding boots. It was only after all that she looked up and smiled at senior servant Zhong. "For morning practice, of course." Senior servant Zhong's face flushed purplish red. Morning practice? She knew that the master and young masters of the estate had the habit of getting up early in the morning to practice martial arts, especially third young master, who would practice every day regardless of the weather outside. That was because House Jingen was a military official family. If they wanted to get a post at court, they had to use their abilities to earn one. However, the young and sweet third young madam was just a 15-year-old girl who still had baby fat on her cheeks. Wasn't the idea she was going to morning practice quite laughable? Xian and the rest hadn't mentioned that third young madam practiced martial arts, either. There was a special martial arts arena and indoor gym in Songtao Court. It was He Changdi who used those areas previously. Now it was Chu Lian who was reaping their benefits. When senior servant Zhong saw that Chu Lian really was going out in such a thin outfit, she quickly grabbed a fox fur-lined cloak from the nearby rack for Chu Lian to wear. "Third young madam, it's already winter. You can't go out wearing so little, you'll freeze." Chu Lian quickly pushed the cloak aside. Was senior servant Zhong joking? How was she going to run in such a thick cloak? "Momo, don't worry. I'll be fine. It's just a little cold. Once I start running later, I won't even feel a thing." After saying so, she quickly strode out of her bedroom, ignoring how senior servant Zhong was shouting and running after her with the fur-lined cloak. When she reached the outside, the cold air attacked her from the front. Chu Lian rubbed her arms and breathed out white puffs of air as she started running around the boundaries of her courtyard. When senior servant Zhong saw that third young madam had really started running around outside dressed in such thin clothing, she was about to continue chasing after third young madam. However, she was held back by Wenlan, who had just come out from the parlor. "What are you holding me back for? Why don't you chase after third young madam and stop her? The matriarch and countess are already unwell. What will we do if something happens to third young madam as well?" Wenlan pressed her lips together and shook her head. She was a martial arts practitioner herself, so she knew better than the old servant did. She replied coolly, "Momo, third young madam will be fine. Running like this is good for her body. Just relax, Momo. Go and check on breakfast in the kitchen and give the cloak to me. I'll stay here and look after third young madam." When senior servant Zhong saw that she couldn't win against Chu Lian and Wenlan, she stomped her foot before shoving the cloak into Wenlan's arms and storming off in a huff. Chu Lian hadn't done any sort of physical exercise for far too long. After a short period of running, she started panting. She slowed down and tried to adjust her breathing. Actually, she had already thought it over last night. Her thought process was simple. Since she had decided to go to the northern border herself, then she had to make sure her body was in the best condition possible. Back in the modern world, she had learned enough that she understood how important a strong and healthy body was. Now that she had decided to make the long journey, she had to do her best to strengthen her body first. She had heard that it would get extremely cold after passing north of the Longxing Basin. The temperatures there couldn't be compared to those in the capital. Some of the older and more experienced servants in the estate had mentioned that simply spitting a mouthful of saliva could make icicles form. Chu Lian's body was just too weak right now. She might not even make it past the Longxing Basin, let alone the rest of the journey north. Whether it was helping with the war in the north or searching for the Snow Mountain Mist's flower, time was of the essence. Without a strong body, she would only become a burden for House Jingen if she went to the northern border. As these thoughts passed through her head, the determination in Chu Lian's heart grew even more. Chapter 273, Preparations, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. A moment later, Wenlan had actually changed into appropriate clothing and began to follow her on her jog. Chu Lian couldn't understand what she was doing. She shot a questioning look at the silly girl. Wenlan pursed her lips before replying, "Third young madam, this servant will accompany you." Chu Lian smiled and nodded. When she felt that she had reached her limit, Chu Lian gradually slowed down and let Wenlan help her into the gym. Eventually, Wenlan's curiosity got the best of her. "Third young madam, why did you suddenly think of jogging? Are you thinking of learning kung fu?" Chu Lian was taken aback. She took a moist towel from Xian to wipe the sweat on her forehead before turning to Wenlan. Initially, Chu Lian shook her head, but then she changed her mind and nodded instead. In the end, she could only verbally explain, "I'm only thinking of learning some basic moves to keep my body healthy and defend myself." Chu Lian's thoughts were usually out of the norm anyway, so Wenlan didn't think much of it. She paused before offering, "Since third young madam has such intentions, would third young madam like this servant to teach you a few self-defense moves?" Chu Lian wanted to slap her leg in realization. Aya, how could she have forgotten that Wenqing and Wenlan knew martial arts? Although she had learned a few self-defense moves in the modern world, how could that compare to Wenqing and Wenlan's actual skills? With them as her teachers, although she might not be able to take on 5 people at once, she might at least have some ability to defend herself against some ruffians if needed. Thus, the period when Chu Lian normally went to visit Matriarch he was converted into morning practice. This continued on for quite a few days. Chu Lian would get up early in the morning before dawn and eat something light before jogging around her courtyard. Next, she would learn some basic moves from Wenqing and Wenlan in the gym. An hour later, she would have her breakfast before going to visit Matriarch He at Qingxi Hall. Every day, a guard from Prince Jin's estate would come to the Jingen estate to report some news about the northern border. As Matriarch His expression turned ever more serious, He Changchi was out from dawn till dusk, listening for more information about the war. The court was still at a loss for what to do. Finally, the day came when Matriarch He could no longer sit still and do nothing. She patted Chu Lian's hand and ordered senior servant Ju to summon He Changchi. Chu Lian observed her expression. Her eyes darted about in thought before she finally said, "Grandmother, are you thinking of sending eldest brother to the northern border?" Matriarch He turned to look at Chu Lian in surprise. She hesitated for a moment before showing a bitter smile. "So Liana has come to the same conclusion as grandmother. The court hasn't been able to think of a solution, but our He family can't just sit back and do nothing. As long as there's still a shred of hope, I won't give up. Sanlang. Sanlang's still so young. He's only 20. There were already far too few descendants of House Jingen. They had been succeeded by a single son generation after generation, and it wasn't until He Changdi's generation that they had finally gotten 3 male descendants. It was already a huge regret that old Count Jingen had died on the battlefield. Now, other than Dalang, the other sons were all in the military somehow. Sanlang had just gotten married not too long ago and he didn't have any sons to carry on his branch. How could Matriarch He bear to see that child sacrifice himself just like that? Matriarch His old eyes turned red and teary. Chu Lian gulped before saying, "Grandmother, let me go to the northern border." The matriarch's tears hadn't even dripped out of her eyes yet. She was instantly frightened by Chu Lian's words. As she stared at Chu Lian in shock, she said, "Sanlang's wife, what are you saying?" Chu Lian looked at Matriarch He earnestly. Her almond-shaped eyes were shining brightly like the stars in the sky, filled with an indomitable spirit. She repeated her words once more. "Grandmother, let me go to the northern border. There's no better choice. Eldest brother has to take care of the estate and he can't leave the capital. Furthermore, he has a job at court to do. My 2 nieces are still young, too. The men of our house are all out, so eldest brother can't leave now." It was only now that Matriarch He realized that Chu Lian was serious. She couldn't react for a moment before she reached out to grasp Chu Lian's hand, and in a heavy tone, she said, "You can't. How can we let a young girl like you go off to a wasteland like the northern border?" Chu Lian had already expected Matriarch His protest. She replied with as gentle a tone as she could muster. "Grandmother, you're an exceptional woman yourself. Didn't you follow grandfather to Xinjiang when you were younger? You're the one who knows the best how we women aren't any less capable than the men. When the time comes, we can hold up our half of the sky. Furthermore, we're not the ones who can decide whether eldest brother can leave the capital or not. It's the emperor." Although Matriarch He hadn't been born into a military family, after getting married to old Count Jingen, she had followed him to the border at Xinjiang. Chu Lian had heard her mother-in-law Countess Jingen mention that Matriarch He had been extremely clever when she was younger and that she had been old Count Jingen's little strategist. Many times, when they had been fighting to death with the Xinjiang people, it was thanks to Matriarch His schemes that old Count Jingen had achieved victory by the skin of his teeth. Chu Lian's words reminded Matriarch He of one thing. The sons of the He family were all stationed out of the estate. He Dalang hadn't taken a post in the capital purely out of consideration for the He family's next generation, it was mostly due to the emperor's wishes. Count Jingen was a general defending one of the country's borders and there was a law that stated that father and son couldn't be in the same army. If He Dalang wanted to succeed the family title and responsibilities, he would have to wait for Count Jingen to retire from Mingju. Furthermore, as the eldest son, the main reason that He Changchi had stayed behind in the capital was to act as a hostage to keep the emperor reassured of their family's loyalty. Since He Dalang had such a status, how could he leave the capital? Chapter 274, Setting Off, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. When Matriarch He heard Chu Lian's explanation, she sunk into silence. In her heart, she knew that Chu Lian was right. She just wasn't willing to face the truth. Chu Lian didn't want to force her into making a decision, so she softened her tone. "Grandmother, let's wait until eldest brother comes back. We can discuss this with eldest brother." Matriarch He nodded with a grave expression on her face. It took He Changchi an hour to rush back to the estate. Once he passed the main entrance, he hurried over to Qingxi Hall. When He Changchi looked up and saw that Chu Lian was present as well, he seemed slightly surprised. Matriarch He pointed at the chair next to her. "Take a seat and rest for a while before we speak." Mu Xiang served some tea to He Changchi. However, he only managed to finish half of it before he could no longer sit still. He set down the teacup and said with a serious face, "Grandmother, what if I plead with the emperor and ask him to allow me to go to the northern border?" Matriarch He was an exception amongst women. She had experienced great upheavals and changes when she was younger. As they waited for He Changchi to arrive, she had continued to think on the matter and came to a conclusion. Sanlang's wife was right. Dalang couldn't leave the capital, so they would have to depend on Sanlang's wife for this trip to the north. After she heard Dalang out, Matriarch He shook her head. Dalang, you know the situation our family is in now. The Emperor will never agree to let you leave the capital. But our He family can't just watch Sanlang fall into danger without doing anything. This old woman has already decided. We'll send Sanlang's wife out to the north. What? He Changchi's shout was full of disbelief and surprise. When he realized that his reaction had been a little over the top, he coughed awkwardly and cast a suspicious glance at Chu Lian, who was sitting beside Matriarch He. Grandmother, this isn't fitting. Third sister-in-law is only 15 and she's a girl. How can we send her to a place as cold as the northern border? What will we do if something happens? Matriarch His expression hardened. So what if she's a girl? So what if she's only 15? Liana managed to make Guilin restaurant famous at the young age of 15. Are you able to do the same? What's more, this old woman followed your grandfather all the way to Xinjiang when I was younger. At that time, I was only 16. Rest assured, we're not going to send her off right this instant. We're definitely going to prepare her as much as possible. I'll send some of our estate's secret guards to follow Liana when it's time to go. She'll be fine. Although He Changchi looked like a rough, burly military official with all brawn and no wits, he was actually very aware of the overall situation. Seeing how decisively grandmother had spoken, he had already guessed that grandmother had already made her decision earlier. He also knew that he couldn't leave the capital that easily. However, as he looked at his young and fragile third sister-in-law, He Changchi couldn't help but inwardly sigh. Could such a small girl really bear these great responsibilities? The mission was to head to the northern border to send help to Sanlang. At the most critical time, she might even have to use all the resources at her disposal to rescue Sanlang. This required both wisdom and foresight. It wasn't going to be as easy as opening a restaurant and cooking up some dishes. He Changchi lamented once again in his heart. He regretted sorely how he hadn't discovered Sanlang's desire to go to the north earlier. If he had known, he would have stopped him on the spot. Since grandmother is already decided, I have nothing to say. However, your grandson has a request. Speak. I will send someone to help out on this trip to the north. If third sister-in-law can't give out orders in the spur of the moment, my representative will make the decisions for her. Upon hearing He Changchi's words, Chu Lian paused before looking at her eldest brother-in-law. Actually, to tell it straight, He Changchi didn't trust in her capabilities at all. However, that was a normal reaction. Although He Changchi hadn't been very successful in managing his marriage, he was a responsible and careful person. If not for the identity of House Jingan's eldest son binding him here, he would have definitely become a brave and wise general in the military. Matriarch He cast a glance at Chu Lian. Seeing that she hadn't gotten angry because of He Changchi's words, she laid her worries to rest. Although Matriarch He hadn't said it out loud, she had also thought of the same possibility that He Changchi was trying to prevent. Chu Lian's calm demeanor gave Matriarch He the feeling that she could rely on this young, tender granddaughter-in-law of hers. Of course, it's natural for eldest brother to make such a request. If I fail to help husband myself, I can't be a burden to others trying to help him. Husband's safety is the most important. He Changchi hadn't expected Chu Lian to be so level-headed and rational. If it were some other family's young wife, they would have cried themselves to sleep in their own courtyard. How would they have thought of personally going out to save their husband? After a moment of stunned surprise, He Changchi nodded and had nothing left to say. The preparations were left for Matriarch He and He Changchi to make. The next day, Matriarch He sent her token to the palace and requested a meeting with the Empress Dowager. Just 2 days later, the Empress Dowager's imperial decree was sent out, ordering honored Lady Jeannie to bring the cotton-padded clothes and blankets that had been donated by the citizens of the capital to support the warriors fighting in the extreme cold of the northern border. Actually, this was just a cover-up for Matriarch His real request to the Empress Dowager. No one had actually collected donations from the citizens. The supplies had been prepared by House Jing'an themselves to perpetuate the lie. He Changqi had already notified Prince Jin. The prince had sent a reply back, saying that he would send some men on the trip as well. The most surprising thing was that Princess Wei had somehow gotten wind of the news too. She personally visited the Jing'an estate along with Royal Princess Duanjia to see Chu Lian. It wasn't just Chu Lian who was surprised by this. Even Matriarch He needed some time to recover from her shock. Chapter 275, Setting Off, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volaronovels. Please read from the original source. Royal Princess Duanjia held on to Chu Lian's arm, trying to persuade her not to go to the northern border. While the two of them were talking inside her bedroom, Matriarch He was entertaining Princess Wei in the parlor outside. Chu Liu, are you crazy? Are you really going to Liangju? I heard my big brother say that you can't even stick out your hands over there, or else they'll freeze. Chu Lian noticed Royal Princess Duanjia's tightly furrowed brows. Her eyes were full of worry. Chu Lian smiled. Princess, the matriarch has already requested this from the Empress Dowager. I have to go. Royal Princess Duanjia immediately stood up, indignant. How can that old woman force you like that? Just tell me now. If you really don't want to go, this princess will go and plead with grandmother the Empress Dowager right now. Chu Lian hurriedly tugged the agitated Royal Princess Duanjia back down. She held on to the princess's arm and shook it. Princess, it's not like that, I wanted to go myself. You. Chu Liu. You're trying to anger me to death. Royal Princess Duanjia's chest heaved up and down in her frustration. Finally, she turned her head and refused to pay attention to Chu Lian. Chu Lian was at a loss for what to do. She could only try to patiently explain her rationale. Princess, He Sanlang is facing danger in the north. Our family can't just sit back and do nothing. Eldest brother can't leave the capital and second brother is away in the next city on imperial business. The only one who can leave the estate is me. Also, if I'm the one to go, we won't alert the enemy. We might even be able to snatch a victory if an opportunity comes along. Royal Princess Duanjia rolled her eyes without any consideration for Chu Lian's feelings. Chu Liu, you don't even know a single martial arts move. What can you do if you go there? Chu Lian didn't intend to hide anything from Royal Princess Duanjia. She admitted, actually, I don't know what I can do. But if I don't go and something happens to He Sanlang, I won't be able to live with myself. Looking at Matriarch He and eldest brother's preparations, they weren't hoping for any miracles from her. She was just meant to be a cover for the He family to send resources to save Sanlang. Royal Princess Duanjia knew that she couldn't convince Chu Lian, so she stomped hard on the floor. Full of dissatisfaction, she said, what did that He Sanlang do in his previous life to marry a wife like you? Did he save the country or something? If I had met you earlier, I would have gotten my brother to marry you so you could be my sister-in-law. When Chu Lian heard Royal Princess Duanjia speak so carelessly, the corners of her mouth twitched. This princess was really daring in her choice of words. Princess. What? Are you unhappy because I'm dissing He Sanlang? He's a good-for-nothing in the first place. What are you defending him for? See, that title of yours had nothing to do with him. When Royal Princess Duanjia wanted to insult people, she went all the way. Luckily, He Changdi wasn't here. Otherwise, he might have choked on his anger and died. When the princess saw that Chu Lian hadn't answered her and was just looking down and sipping her honey water, Royal Princess Duanjia suddenly sucked in her breath. She moved closer to Chu Lian and said, Chu Liu, have you really fallen in love with that He Sanlang? Chu Lian was speechless. She didn't understand how Royal Princess Duanjia's mind could leap to conclusions like that. Why was she suddenly asking about the feelings between her and her husband? When Chu Lian only looked up and blinked at her, Royal Princess Duanjia became more anxious. Chu Liu, how could you be so silly? Are you made of putty? That stupid man abandoned you 5 days into your marriage, but you've actually set your heart on going to the northern border to save him from danger. If it were me, I wouldn't even care if he lived or not. It would be best if he just died. This princess can still take another husband. Chu Lian almost spit out the honey water in her mouth thanks to Royal Princess Duanjia's outrageous words. She didn't ignore Royal Princess Duanjia's complaints and replied frankly, "I'm not going to the northern border just for He Sanlang. It's more for the sake of House Jingen, since I'm the third young madam of House Jingen first and foremost. As long as House Jingen is doing well, I'll be able to live my days well, too." It was only when Royal Princess Duanjia heard Chu Lian's reply that she turned quiet. She stopped refuting Chu Lian and remained silent for a moment. Finally, she looked up and met Chu Lian's eyes. "Chu Liu, you have to be careful when you go to the northern border. I'll ask my father to send some guards to protect you." Chu Lian smiled. "Princess, it's not as dangerous as you think. I'm not going to the army camp, so why would anything happen to me? At most, I'll be staying in Liangju City for a while." "Oh yes, didn't you say you wanted to eat hot pot some time ago? Why don't we eat hot pot together today since we have the chance?" Although saliva had already begun to pool in her mouth, Royal Princess Duanjia still rolled her eyes at Chu Lian. She complained, "Chu Liu, you're still thinking about food at this time?" Chu Lian made a phut sound. "So Tilda Princess doesn't want to eat hot pot? Then I'll tell Xian and the rest to stop preparing it." Just as Chu Lian was about to stand up and do exactly that, Royal Princess Duanjia tugged on her sleeve and said, Chu Liu, since you want to eat hot pot, then this princess will do you a favor and accompany you for a meal." Chu Lian covered her smile and shot a look at Royal Princess Duanjia. As expected, once food was mentioned, Royal Princess Duanjia had been successfully distracted. In an instant, she had already started to ask more questions. How was hot pot made? Could they really put all sorts of food in to cook? Would it still taste good that way? After the meal, Princess Wei grasped Chu Lian's hand and nagged at her for a long time. It wasn't until after 2 p.m. that Princess Wei and Royal Princess Duanjia finally went home in a low-key manner. The situation in the north could change at any moment, so House Jingen didn't dare to tarry. They quickly set the date for Chu Lian's departure to the north. Very coincidentally, it happened to be the day of Xiaobo Jian's appreciation banquet in the Ying estate. TL note: hot pot is one of my fave foods even though I live on an ever-sunny island and I don't actually have to keep warm in winter. LOL. Amazing spread of hot pot dishes, cool looking and spicy hot pot. My personal fave. Marbled Japanese beef dipped in a simple kelp broth or sukiyaki broth. Shabu shabu wagyu beef. Chapter 276, Retribution, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. To travel from the capital to the northern border, most common folk and merchants would choose to use the government-built highway. The highway passed through many important towns and cities, and it was very convenient for doing business or taking a break on the road. However, because Chu Lian and her party were rushing to the northern border, they couldn't take any detours on the road. Furthermore, they were traveling light. Other than the few carriages of cotton clothes and blankets, they didn't have to take any heavy loads into consideration. Thus, after Matriarch He and He Changchi had a discussion with the private soldiers serving their family, they chose a small road that led to Liangju. The small road cut straight into the hinterland of the northern border from the outskirts of the capital. There weren't any small villages they could rest in along the way, and there might even be stretches of days where there wouldn't be any water sources nearby. For the most part, they would be traveling through mountain forests, but that meant they would have to have enough supplies or some skilled hunters as part of their entourage. Otherwise, it would be hard to reach the northern border. However, they could save a lot of time traveling on a small road like this as long as they had a good horse under them. It would only take around 10 to 20 days to reach Liangju from the capital, and it would cut their travel time by 2/3 as compared to the highway. As the day of her departure grew closer and closer, Chu Lian didn't dare to waste a single second of her time. She continued waking up before the sun was up to practice. She was now extremely familiar with the few moves that Wenqing and Wenlan had taught her for self-defense. She also went over to Great Dr. Miao's to ask for some preventives and also for medicines that could cure the most common wounds. Great Dr. Miao was very generous towards Chu Lian and packed up a bundle for her that included a bottle each of poison antidotes, bug repellent, and even frostbite and burn salves. Chu Lian also passed manager Qin a list of things and had him prepare everything on the list for her. The day before departure, 2 guards came from Prince Wei's estate, saying that they were sent by Princess Wei to protect Chu Lian's safety on the trip. The guards were a pair of siblings, an older brother and a younger sister. The man was called Li Xing while the woman was called Li Yu. The 2 siblings looked similar, both dressed in a guard's uniform from the prince's estate with their heads lowered respectfully. It was the first time Chu Lian had met them, so she didn't know what their personalities were like. Since Princess Wei had sent them specially for her, Chu Lian couldn't reject them. She told Xian to bring the 2 guards to a room so they could rest. When it was finally the day of departure, Chu Lian had already finished packing all of her luggage. Prince Jin sent a small team of men and horses, about 20 people in all. The leader was a young man called Tang Yang. Tang Yang had already seen Chu Lian before, but this was the first time that Chu Lian had seen him. Tang Yang walked up to Chu Lian. When he saw the things piled up inside the carriage, his jaw almost dropped from shock. He first bowed towards Chu Lian and gave a simple self-introduction before gaping as he asked, Is this all of honored lady's luggage? Chu Lian nodded while standing next to the carriage, a calm expression on her face. It is. Is there any problem, Sir Tang? Tang Yang opened his mouth as if wanting to speak. In the end, he couldn't resist giving her a reminder. Actually, honored lady, you don't have to bring so many things. Your estate has already informed His Highness that we're going to be using a small road, so this subordinate has already ordered the men to prepare enough food and supplies. We've also brought a doctor and a cook along. Chu Lian looked at him and then tilted her head. Then could Sir Tang tell us how many carriages of goods we're bringing on this trip? At least 9 to 10. Chu Lian nodded. Since that's so, it won't be much to bring along one more carriage. Furthermore, these are just some day-to-day items that I'm used to using. They're just a few items, not worth a mention. Tang Yang didn't know how to reply to this statement. He cast a glance at the full carriage next to her. Wasn't that a small metal pot sticking out from the corner? He sweated and inwardly complained, how is that not worth a mention? She's even brought pots and pans along. This is going to be a harsh journey with very little food. Is she going to cook up some delicacies with that pot? When Chu Lian was about to leave, everyone in the estate except the grounded Madame Zhu and the bedridden Countess Jingen came out to send her off. For this trip to the north, Chu Lian was going to bring Wenqing and Wenlan with her, as well as manager Qin. The other people in the party were all arranged by Matriarch He. She heard that Matriarch He had also sent 2 secret bodyguards. However, they were to remain hidden and wouldn't appear except when needed. Other than that, there were also the 2 guards that Princess Wei had sent, Li Xing and Li Yu. In front of the estate's entrance, He Daling was talking to Tang Yang while Matriarch He took Chu Lian's hands in hers, unwilling to part. Liana, it'll be hard on you for this trip to the north. You must take care of your own safety first and foremost. Grandmother, don't worry. I can take care of myself. I'm also bringing Wenqing and Wenlan. It's grandmother who should take better care of your health. When granddaughter-in-law returns home with husband, I want to see a bright and healthy grandmother. Matriarch He nodded, her eyes slightly moist. She patted Chu Lian's hand and tucked away some stray strands of hair for her before urging her to get onto the carriage. Chapter 277, Retribution, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volaronovels. Please read from the original source. Standing off to one side, senior servant Gui's eyes were already red. She had raised Chu Lian and followed her all the way to her husband's household. This was the first time that she was going to be separated from her. If only she had been a few years younger, then she might have followed along with or without Chu Lian's permission. Chu Lian stepped onto the carriage and turned back to look. When she saw that senior servant Gui had come out with Xian to chase after her, she felt the corners of her eyes turn a little wet as well. Chu Lian shouted, Momo, Xian, go back. Senior servant Gui covered her mouth with a handkerchief before nodding forcefully, Third young madam, don't worry. This old servant will take good care of Songtao Court for you. Chu Lian turned around and stopped looking back. She stepped forcefully onto the step and boarded the carriage. Then she was seen no more as the felt curtain fell over the entrance, blocking the wind and all the gazes of the crowd. House Jingen's private troops and Tang Yang's team quickly disappeared from House Jingen's entrance. It wasn't until they could no longer see any of the party that Changqi personally escorted Matriarch He back into the estate. Half a day after Chu Lian had left, in the afternoon, a messy-haired, crazy-looking woman stumbled over to the normally peaceful entrance of the Jingen estate. Her hair was a complete mess and her face was covered in dirt, making her unrecognizable. She lurched over to the Jingen estate's entrance and tried to enter, but how could the manservant guarding the door let her in just like that? He kicked her to the ground. Where did this crazy woman come from? Hey, can't you see where this is? How dare you try to charge into the estate? Are you sick of living? The messy-haired woman laid on the floor, groaning in pain. After a moment, she started shouting, "Quick, notify third young madam. I'm third young madam's handmaid." "Right, I'm a handmaid who married over with third young madam. Quick, notify third young madam for me." The door guard looked at her in contempt. "TCH, you're just a miserable lying wretch. Trying to impersonate a handmaid of one of our noble madams? Why don't you take a look in the mirror first? Let me tell you, I've seen all the handmaids serving our third young madam before. Not a single one of them looks like you." When the woman heard the door guard's disdainful words, her expression almost cracked. She crawled off the ground and tried to pull at the hem of his clothes. She even brushed aside the messy hair covering her face, revealing her looks. Unfortunately, her face was still covered in dirt. The hand she used to grasp at the manservant was also covered in rotting sores. "Look at my face. Look at my face. I'm one of honored Lady Jeannie's handmaids. It was third young madam who gave me my name. I'm Ming Yang. My name is Ming Yang. Please, go in and notify third young madam for me. Please." The manservant was completely disgusted by her blackened face and sore-covered hands. How could he bother with discerning her looks? He kicked Ming Yang away again with an expression full of loathing. "Stupid beggar. Stop acting. If you continue like this, I'll get the city guards to come over and throw you into jail." The manservant harumphed inwardly. The only handmaids serving third young madam were called Xian, Fuyan, and Jingyan. There was also Miss Wenqing. When had there ever been some Ming Yang? Did this person really think that she could bluff her way into the Jingen estate just by giving herself a name ending with Yang? How could Ming Yang possibly give up her last chance at survival? Even though her body was already weak, she found the last remnants of her strength and stumbled forward a few steps. She grabbed onto the door guard's calf and pleaded, "Please, please, just let me meet third young madam, just once. As long as you help me pass a message to her, I'll give you whatever you want. Alright, I know third young madam's secret recipes. If you send a message for me, I'll tell them to you. I'll give them all to you." The manservant was already at the limits of his disgust thanks to this crazy woman. This time, he showed no mercy and called over two others to pull away the madwoman hugging his leg. They forcefully removed her and tossed her down the steps in front of the estate's entrance. The door guard had one last parting remark for her. "Let me tell you, even if you really know third young madam, you're too late. Our third young madam received an imperial edict to go to the north, and she's already left." After that, he stopped bothering with the madwoman. He ordered the two retainers to beat the woman to death with some rods if she dared to get close to the entrance again. Ming Yan's dull eyes widened, her expression filled with disbelief. She shook her head in denial. How could it be? How was that possible? Third young madam went to the north. How could that be? If third young madam was no longer in the estate, then who was going to save her life? No matter how much Ming Yang tried, she wasn't able to enter the Jingen estate. In the end, the guards tossed her into one of the corners outside the estate. Ming Yang hugged her knees to herself and curled up where she was. The cold invaded her body, stealing away her warmth and making her stiff with frost. In her mind, she couldn't help but think back to the days she had lived with Chu Lian in Songtao Court. Third young madam had been so friendly, and she had never mistreated any of her servants. Although third young master wasn't around, the servants of Songtao Court could always walk around with straight backs. Third young madam had bestowed golden hairpins and rings on her handmaids. Those designs were so pretty. It had been her first time seeing such beautiful jewelry in her life. What a pity that it was all gone. Someone else had taken them from her. Third young madam had never avoided her handmaids when making one of her secret recipes. She would even teach them a little more when she was happy. Once, Mingyang had made a gamble and asked third young madam for some dessert recipes. Third young madam hadn't gotten mad in the slightest and patiently instructed her. And after the first time she explained it, third young madam had even asked if the steps were clear enough. The secret recipes she had learned from third young madam had become hers. If those people wanted to steal them for themselves, even if her hands rotted away, she wasn't going to reveal third young madam's secret recipes to anyone. As Mingyan's thoughts ran through her head, she looked up at the high wall of the estate behind her. How she wished that she hadn't been possessed by greed back then. Chapter 278, The Passing of a Woman, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. That stubborn and loyal Xian had still ended up with a better fate than hers. Mingyang felt like she was immersed in the middle of an ice-covered lake. Although there was still a tiny bit of warmth left in her chest, it felt like a flickering candle flame, slowly shrinking and fading away. She leaned against the cold wall behind her, the memories from the Zheng estate swirling in her mind. Old Duke Zheng's visits to Guilin Restaurant had become more and more frequent. A month after Guilin Restaurant had opened, the old Duke was having all his meals at the restaurant apart from breakfast. Chu Lian had specially reserved a small court in Guilin Restaurant for old Duke Zheng. As long as he went over there at mealtimes, he didn't need to queue at all and he would be able to eat any of the dishes in Guilin Restaurant. Ever so slowly, old Duke Zheng started to feel that Mingyan's dishes weren't as appetizing as before. One day, after old Duke Zheng had come back to the estate, old Duchess Zheng asked her husband what he would like to eat at night. Old Duke Zheng had just casually replied with top-grade hot pot. He had eaten that dish at Guilin Restaurant in the afternoon and it was one of the restaurant's new dishes for the month. He had only eaten it once before, so he hadn't had enough. The answer he gave his wife came entirely from his subconscious. The old cooks in the Zheng estate were pretty much useless by now. It was mostly Mingyang who was in charge of old Duke Zheng's kitchen. Since old Duke Zheng had made a request, the responsibility of actually making the dish fell onto Mingyan's shoulders. Due to the fact that she would chase everyone out whenever she cooked in the kitchen, the servants in the kitchen were already biased against her. After old Duke Zheng had requested this completely foreign dish, no one was willing to speak up for her. Mingyang was almost dancing on the spot from her anxiety. She didn't know how to make this top-grade hot pot at all. Back then, she had started hating Chu Lian. Why hadn't Chu Lian taught her a few more secret recipes? If she had, then she wouldn't be in this desperate state right now. Of course, she wasn't able to make the top-grade hot pot. Mingyang was summoned by old Duchess Zheng and suffered a harsh scolding. It wasn't until she was kneeling before the old Duchess that Mingyang finally realized she was at the end of her path. Thus, she started thinking up a scheme for her own survival. Zheng would come over to old Duke Zheng's courtyard every morning for breakfast. She used that chance to slip some drugs into his food. However, before Zheng had even touched the drug-laced food, a maidservant had already reported Mingyan's actions to the younger Duchess Zheng. The Zheng estate only had this one heir, so he was absolutely precious to them. Duchess Zheng kept watch over him tightly. When she found out that her son had almost been drugged by a maidservant, she exploded. Thus, Duchess Zheng personally took over the punishment and had Mingyang beaten until she was half dead. After that, she ordered the servants to buy some drugs that could make her hands lame so she would never cook again. There was no shortage of skeletons in the closet behind the tall walls of the inner court. While the matriarchs of noble families were elegant and poised on the outside, their hands were likely stained with the blood of countless people. Duchess Zheng was not a soft-hearted matriarch. Furthermore, Mingyang was just a servant. As favored as she was still just a servant who could cook a little. In the eyes of most masters, she was no different than a dog. While Mingyang was being punished, old Duke Zheng didn't even try to plead for mercy for her. In the end, Mingyang used all her savings to bribe the maidservant guarding the entrance so she could escape from the Zheng estate. The first person she had thought to seek help from was Chu Lian. Unfortunately, she was never going to be able to meet her again. As the last vestiges of warmth faded from Mingyang's heart, the soft glow of the afternoon sun shone upon her head. The next day, Xian led a few maidservants out from the side entrance on an errand to Guilin restaurant. The moment she stepped out, she noticed the broken body lying in a corner outside the estate. The menial servant guarding the door noticed Xian's frown and quickly tried smiling in a placating manner. "Miss Xian, that's just a lunatic. She kept fussing and trying to enter the estate yesterday, claiming that she's one of third young madam's handmaids. In the end, the guards at the entrance beat her up and threw her out. She crawled into that corner herself. Maybe she's already lost the little bit of life left in her." Handmaid. A bad premonition surfaced in Xian's heart. She quickly ordered for 2 manservants to come. By the time they checked the body, the woman was no longer breathing. When the manservant pulled aside the messy hair covering the woman's face, Xian sucked in a gasp of cold air. It really was Mingyang. Standing before a sister who had served together with her in the past, Xian's heart was filled with mixed emotions. She stood in silence for a long moment until the manservant next to her carefully asked, "Miss Xian, what should we do?" Xian took in a deep breath and suppressed the burgeoning emotions threatening to burst out of her. She took out a silver ingot from her sleeve and passed it to the manservant. "Buy a coffin and bury her." Mingyang had been part of the dowry when Chu Lian had married into the Jing'an estate. Before that, she had just been a newly bought servant who had no parents or relatives. Xian cast one last look at that cold, stiff body before leading her party away without another look back. Mingyang had chosen her own path. The only person she could blame for her end was herself. Chapter 279, The Passing of a Woman, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. On the day that Chu Lian had departed for the north, the Ying estate was bustling with noise and excitement. Early in the morning, the Ying estate had opened its doors and begun welcoming guests at the main entrance. Even the manservants and retainers guarding the doors were all wearing new uniforms. By holding his appreciation banquet at the Ying estate, Xiaobo Jian had lifted the declining House Ying into a position of fame once more. House Ying had never been so lively, even during weddings. When it was close to 11 a.m. and most of the guests had arrived, everyone gathered in the main hall to greet old Duke Ying and present their gifts. Within a study in the outer court of the Ying estate, Xiaobo Jian had already changed into a brocade robe. He was wearing a white jade crown on his head. There was no trace of his usual gloom in his narrow, slanted eyes. Instead, they appeared energetic and full of life. He was currently standing at the top position amongst his peers, looking down upon them from a metaphorical mountain. No wonder he seemed to be in a great mood and in high spirits. Xiaobo Jian straightened a ribbon tied to his belt. He placed that lucky jade amulet with great care into the purse tied around his waist. Before he slipped it in, he even rubbed it affectionately. By the time he had finished preparing himself, one had entered the study after knocking on the door. One stood right next to him with his head lowered, silent and not daring to meet his eyes. In his happiness, Xiaobo Jian didn't notice one's mood and immediately asked, "Has she come?" One stiffened. He hesitated before gritting his teeth and pretending to be muddled as he asked, "Who does master mean by she?" Xiaobo Jian's originally high mood sunk into a gloomy low. His gaze was as sharp as a knife as he turned it on one. "One, don't play stupid with me. Where's Liana?" One knew he couldn't hide the truth any longer. In the face of his master's dissatisfaction, he could only reply, "Honored Lady Jeannie didn't come today. The matriarch of House Jing'an only sent a servant carrying gifts." What? The air around Xiaobo Jian turned frighteningly stiff and cold. How could that be? I even got second master to send an invite. Why wouldn't Liana come? It was his appreciation banquet today, and it was even being held at the Ying estate. One didn't dare to hide anything from Xiaobo Jian in his current state. "Master, it's not that honored Lady Jeannie wasn't willing to come. Honored Lady Jeannie has gone off to the northern border. The northern border. It was as if a bolt had struck Xiaobo Jian's head out of the blue. Right after getting the top rank out of all the scholars this year, the emperor had summoned him for a meeting. Following that, he had to attend a banquet held in celebration of the top few scholars, and that involved socializing with the others. He hadn't been able to pay attention to Chu Lian's activities for the past few days. Who could have known that she had gone off to the north while he was still waiting to meet her again? Xiaobo Jian knew that war had broken out in the northern border. However, he had just been recognized as one of the literati. He couldn't interfere with politics yet. After getting an official post, he still had to stay in the Imperial Academy and continue studying. These weren't things within his control. Actually, he had even been a little happy over the news of the war in the north. He Changdi was in the north. If the war didn't go well and He Changdi just dropped dead, then no one would fight him for Liana. He completely hadn't expected Chu Lian to go to the north herself. She would rather risk her life to search for a heartless husband than come and see a lover completely besotted with her. Xiaobo Jian's earlier good mood had dissipated by now. His hands curled into fists. Tell me, when did Liana leave? One kept his head lowered as he replied, replying to Master, Honored Lady Jeannie left early this morning. Xiaobo Jian could no longer hold back his rage. He slammed the table with his hand, turning his fair palm red. However, that was already beyond his caring. Send some men to chase after her. Even if you have to kidnap her, you have to bring Liana back for me. One immediately sucked in his breath in surprise. He quickly tried to stop his master. Master, you can't. Honored Lady Jeannie has Prince Jin's men with her. She's going to the north to support the northern border troops with the Empress Dowager's imperial edict. If we stick our hands in this and get discovered, then all our previous efforts will be wasted. Xiaobo Jian bit his lip forcefully. Finally, he swept all the things on the table to the floor. In a short instant, the study had turned into a mess. One stood in the corner, not daring to move, trying his best to reduce his presence. After a long moment of silence, Xiaobo Jian ordered, send some men to follow her, and don't alert the enemy. When one heard this order, he made a cupped fist salute and quickly left the messy scene. Xiaobo Jian collapsed dejectedly into a chair behind the desk. His originally effeminate face was twisted into a ruthless yet pained expression. He looked like a blood-sucking demon who had crawled out of the depths of hell. A voice was screaming in his heart, Liana, how could you abandon me and choose him instead? Were all those feelings that they had shared just lies? When he thought of how Chu Lian would be reunited with He Changdi like a pair of lovebirds in the north, the pain in Xiaobo Jian's heart was indescribable. One of his hands was still tightly curled around the purse containing the lucky jade amulet. He swore secretly in his heart that one day, he would make Chu Lian regret her choice and beg for the chance to return to his side. If Chu Lian were to find out what Xiaobo Jian was thinking right now, she would surely roll her eyes and lament at how the men around her were all crazy lunatics. The team headed to the north traveled as quickly as they could, in order to reach the northern border at the earliest possible moment to find out as much as they could about the situation. This time, the commander of the private soldiers who had come along with Chu Lian was an old subordinate of old Count Jingen. He was over 40 years old now and skilled in martial arts. When he was younger, he had trained in the army for over 20 years. It was only after old Count Jingen's death on the battlefields that he had finally returned to the capital to become one of House Jingen's private soldiers. This old subordinate was called Mo Chenggui. Even in front of Count Jingen, he was someone who enjoyed a fair amount of prestige. For this mission, he would be the one to take over the command at critical moments. House Jingen's private soldiers didn't normally live in the Jingen estate. They would take shifts to guard the estate, but most of them lived in a village on the outskirts of the capital. Chapter 280, Rabbit Hotpot, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. This time, there were 15 private soldiers accompanying Chu Lian to the northern border. Adding the estate guards and retainers raised the total count to more than 30. Mo Chenggui was an old soldier. The imposing aura around him from his years on the battlefield made him hard to approach. Even when facing Prince Jin's subordinate, Tang Yang, he was unshakable. Coupled with the deep scar that cut across the left side of his face, he felt cold, terrifying, and unapproachable to the others. Amongst the party heading to the north, the men were all riding horses. Only Chu Lian and her two maidservants, Wenqing and Wenlan, were seated inside a carriage. Manager Qin, who wasn't that good at riding, was placed at the front of the carriage next to the manservant driving it. The further north they went, the colder it got. Chu Lian was wrapped up in a large cloak with a foxfur robe on the outside. She hugged a warm water bottle in her arms. Even so, she still felt cold. She was glad she had tried to train her body for half a month before departing on the journey. Otherwise, she would have definitely fallen ill before even reaching the north. The road wasn't smooth, causing the carriage to shake along the way. Chu Lian couldn't read her book in that sort of situation, so to keep herself awake, she started playing a card game called Mahjia with Wenqing and Wenlan. As the cheery sounds of laughter resounded from within the carriage, Mo Chungue's thug-like countenance took on a fierce cast. His roughened hands tightened on the reins he was holding. He had thought highly of this third young madam at first. Not just any young miss had the spirit and determination to go to the bitterly cold northern border. Thus, he hadn't said a word when he had seen how much luggage she was bringing. However, he hadn't expected her to be frolicking so happily in the carriage without any consideration for their circumstances. She was just a spoiled little noble girl after all. Did she think they were going out on a leisure trip? She probably hadn't expected the weather in the north to be this bad. It probably wouldn't take very long before this third young madam would start making a fuss to turn back. However, he was going there to help third young master. Even if third young madam were to pester him with unreasonable demands along the way, it wasn't his business to care about what happened to her. The corner of Mo Chungue's lips raised at a cold angle. While riding his horse alongside the carriage, Tang Yang was having similar thoughts to Mo Chengui. However, he simply shook his head and smiled, instead of showing his thoughts on his face like Mo Chengui. He cast a look at the carriage, eyes shifting into upturned crescents like a wily fox. He was waiting for a good show. Manager Qin straightened the fur hat that almost engulfed his head with its size. With his hands tucked into the sleeves of his cotton robe, he looked like a rough man from the northeast. His eyes were narrowed as he looked between the private soldiers and guards on both sides of the carriage. At a time when no one was paying attention to him, he curled his lip and inwardly harumphed. Third young madam was right. These people were inflated with their own self-importance, disdainful of others just because they were physically stronger. They actually dared to look down on their third young madam. Before they had even reached the north, the petty manager Qin was already holding a grudge against Tang Yang and Mo Chengui for this matter. Their party had been on the road for a day. Seeing that the sky was turning dark and it would be dangerous to continue traveling since they were currently in a mountain forest, Mo Chengui and Tang Yang decided to rest a night in the forest after some discussion. The party stopped and Tang Yang ordered some men to start up a fire and cook the evening meal. Mo Chengui started assigning guard duty for the night to the old soldiers and guards. Chu Lian was helped off the carriage by Wenqing. The moment she stepped on the ground, she noticed that Manager Qin and the two Li siblings had already put up her tent for the night. Li Xing and Li Yu seemed to have undergone some special training and were especially good at taking care of her needs while roughing it outside. Even Tang Yang and Mo Chengui couldn't compare to them when it came to building a comfortable sleeping space in the woods. Chu Lian was really starting to like this pair of siblings. After Wenqing brought her to sit on a thick fur carpet outside the tent, Chu Lian started ordering her servants around. Chu Lian wasn't someone who would let herself suffer. Although they were roughing it out in the wild, she was never going to make a shabby meal as long as it was within her limits to do better. Hunger breeds discontent, after all. They would only have the strength to carry on if they ate well. Wenlan stoked up the fire and took out a bronze stove to boil some water. Meanwhile, Chu Lian instructed Wenqing to retrieve a specially made bronze pot from the carriage, which had a little opening in the center to allow room for smoke to rise up. Following that, she grabbed a few different types of dried vegetables from an indigo bag and tossed them into the hot water to soak. Chu Lian personally seasoned the broth with the set of spice containers she had made sure to bring along. She also instructed Li Xing to bring some private soldiers with him to hunt in the nearby forest. Once Chu Lian was finished with her side of the preparations, Li Xing had returned with 3 fat rabbits. Li Yu took the live rabbits and went over to the nearby brook to take care of them. In just an hour, Chu Lian's rabbit hotpot was completed. Li Xing was skilled with his knife. He cut the lean rabbit meat into thin slices. When it was time to eat, they just had to swish the slices around for a few moments in the fragrant, boiling broth before it was cooked. The broth was slightly spicy, so their bodies warmed up as they ate. Although the dried vegetables weren't as tasty as fresh ones, they were like a heavenly blessing in this cold winter season when it was usually impossible to get any vegetables at all. Wenqing used the campfire to cook a small pot of rice to pair with the rabbit hot pot. Their meal for tonight was snow-white rice and green vegetables soaked in the spicy red rabbit hot pot broth. Even those with smaller appetites could probably finish a huge bowl of it by themselves. For the servants following third young madam on this dull and hasty journey, the time they looked forward to every day was meal time. TL note: Mahjong is a Chinese gambling card game. The Wikipedia article has the rules and explanation https://en. Wikipedia. Org Wiki Mahjong. Their special bronze pot probably looks like this. Steamboat pot, and of course, here we have the rabbit hot pot. Rabbit hot pot. Chapter 281, Rabbit Hot Pot, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian was protective and generous towards her own people. Whatever she ate each day was exactly what Wenqing and Wenlan could eat each day. Thus, Chu Lian, Wenqing, Wenlan, Manager Qin, Li Xing and Li Yu would prepare their own meal together every night. As for the rest, House Jing'an's private soldiers were grouped together under Mo Chungui's lead while Tang Yang and Prince Jin's guards shared their meal. The rabbits that Li Xing had hunted today were big and fat, so Chu Lian told Wenqing to take some to Mo Chengui and Tang Yang. After eating the warm rabbit hot pot, Chu Lian had already entered her tent to rest under the care of Wenlan and Li Yu. Wenqing reached Mo Chengui and Tang Yang's tent with a box of food in hand. When she entered the tent, she saw that Mo Chengui and Tang Yang seemed to be in the middle of discussing something. The 2 men stopped talking after she entered, and they seemed to be in equally bad moods. It was clear that their discussion wasn't going well. However, that wasn't any of Wenqing's business. She bobbed in greeting to them before saying, "Third young madam has specially sent this servant with some food after seeing how sirs have worked so hard all day." Mo Chengui cast a disdainful glance at Wenlan without bothering to reply her. Contempt filled his heart. What did that third young madam know how to do besides enjoying life all day? What a burden. If they didn't need to use her name as an excuse to go to the northern border, he wouldn't have agreed to let such a spoiled young madam join their journey. Tang Yang was more smooth and slick. When he saw that Mo Chengui had simply remained silent with a dark expression and that the air was turning awkward, he quickly spoke up. "Miss Wenqing, please put down the food here. It's getting late, so please thank honored lady for us when you return." Wenqing wasn't stupid. She could see how dissatisfied Mo Chengui and Tang Yang were towards her master. Thus, she dropped all sense of decorum towards them and set the food down. Without another word, Wenqing turned to leave the tent as if she couldn't bear to stay in their presence for even a second more. After Wenqing disappeared from their sight, Mo Chengui harumphed. "This subordinate is too lowly to enjoy the rewards that third young madam has bestowed. Brother Tang, this lowly one will leave it to you." After saying so, he tossed his sleeves and left. Tang Yang watched Mo Chungui's tall, burly back disappear before shifting his gaze to the box of food that Wenqing had left behind. Although he didn't show it on his face, his heart was filled with unhappiness. How could honored Lady Jeannie only be thinking of food at a time like this? He coughed to clear his painfully dry throat and shook his head. She was still too young after all. She had probably saved Prince Jin and Royal Princess Duanjia out of luck back then in Dufeng Tea House. Tang Yang waved his hand towards the 2 guards standing behind him and said, "I'll leave honored lady's rewards to you guys. Don't waste it." The 2 guards had similar expressions of excitement and happiness as their eyes widened. They almost failed to hold back their drool. They had just switched shifts with the guards in the tent. Previously, they had been standing not too far from where Honored Lady was cooking. When the wind had blown past, it had carried an absolutely delicious smell along with it. The guards were well accustomed to eating dry wheat pancakes while out on duty, but after smelling that aroma, the dried rations in their hands seemed hard to swallow compared to that rabbit meat. However, the guards were very disciplined. There was a huge difference in status between them and Honored Lady Jeannie, so they would never dare to try and ask for food from her. Thus, their only option was to bear with the tantalizing scent of the hot pot and stuff their dry rations into their mouths, forcing it down even as they almost choked on it. But now, Sir Tang was actually bestowing Honored Lady's food upon them. Who could have expected such a miraculous gift would fall right into their laps? The two guards immediately shouted their thanks and started discussing whether they should eat it in Sir Tang's tent, so that they wouldn't get robbed of their delicious food by the pack of hungry ghosts outside. One of the guards turned to Tang Yang with a bright smile. "Sir, we're on duty now, so it's not convenient for us to leave the tent. Sir, please grant us permission to eat here." Tang Yang glared at the two guards. "Don't think that I can't tell what you're trying to do. Fine, just eat here then. Send the box back to Honored Lady when you're done. Remember, don't let her know that you gluttons were the ones who ate it." "Yes, yes, yes. Many thanks to Sir for granting us this boon." The two men immediately took the box of food and set it on a short table in the corner. Upon opening it, the two guards' eyes alighted with joy. They both took in a deep breath. It was this exact aroma. This was what Honored Lady's servants had made today. He had heard Brother Li Xing say that this was called rabbit hot pot, and that it was delicious. The two guards couldn't stay still any longer. They grabbed their chopsticks and quickly began gulping down the food. Tang Yang had gotten a cold sometime during the past 2 days. Luckily, it wasn't too severe. He just lost his sense of taste and had his nose blocked some of the time. Due to his sickness, he hadn't had much appetite recently. He would just drink a bowl or two of gruel to fill up his stomach. However, as the spicy, fragrant smell of rabbit hot pot filled the tent and invaded his nostrils, Tang Yang's nose twitched. He turned towards that smell and sniffed the air again before realizing that it was coming from the table where the two guards were eating. When he looked at how the two guards had practically buried their faces into their bowls, Tang Yang couldn't resist gulping. What kind of dish was that? It was a deep red, and some sort of heavenly smell was drifting up from it. It looked really tasty. TL note: a quick shout out Fort Helt, winner of Miss Volar 2018. If you're looking for stories to read while waiting for more TMR, try reading her novel Split Zone 13. SZ13 is a paranormal adventure set in the modern world, where comatose patients arrive in the mysterious Split Zone 13 with special powers. Follow Li Shun, who has to battle her missing memories and multiple identity disorder as she tries to escape from her coma and save all she holds dear. There are over 80 chapters out now, and the alt posts 5 chapters every week. Chapter 282, Sneak Attack. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. As Tang Yang sat behind his desk, he stared at the two ravenous guards sitting in the corner. Finally, he could take it no longer and coughed twice on purpose. The guards were so focused on eating their thin, tender slices of rabbit meat that they didn't even raise their heads. Tang Yang's expression turned stormy. He stood up and walked towards the guards. One of the guards spared a glance at Tang Yang before turning back to his food and eating even faster. Wave after wave of that delicious-smelling rabbit hot pot attacked Tang Yang's senses. Coupled with how the guards were wolfing down their food, Tang Yang felt himself getting even hungrier. When he saw that there wasn't much left in the bowl, Tang Yang quickly said, "How is the taste of Honored Lady's food?" The two guards hurriedly nodded. In their rush to eat, they couldn't even speak, they simply gave 2 thumbs up. Tang Yang hadn't expected these two guys to be so thick. They couldn't understand what he was getting at all. "How tasty is it?" One of the guards replied around a mouthful of meat, "Sir, you follow His Highness Prince Jin every day, so you must eat good food really often. You can't possibly be trying to fight with us for this hot pot, right? You just bestowed this to us too." Tang Yang didn't know how to reply to that. His face flushed red and he harumphed. Then, he began to scold them. All you know how to do is eat. What a bunch of gluttons. Hurry up and eat faster. Can't you tell that the whole tent smells like rabbit hot pot now? Actually, Tang Yang's reminder was completely unnecessary. In less than 15 minutes, the whole bowl of steaming rabbit hot pot had disappeared down the gullets of the two guards. There wasn't even a single drop of soup left. Tang Yang wanted to kick both of them out of his tent in rage. After Wenqing returned from sending the rabbit hot pot, she reported Mo Chenggui and Tang Yang's reactions to Chu Lian. Chu Lian simply smiled and entered her tent to rest for the night. The next day, the party set off early in the morning. By this time, they had already covered more than half of the distance to Liangju. In the afternoon, the party was just preparing to set off again after a break when Tang Yang received some news about the northern border. The report said that something unexpected had happened in the northern border troops and there was a fierce battle going on outside Liangju city. Before Chu Lian could react, Mo Chenggui had already started getting antsy. They were already traveling at the fastest speed they could manage, since they were using a small road and not the well-maintained highway. However, since there was a female guest amongst their party and they were also towing those cotton clothes, blankets, and other goods along with them, they couldn't travel at a faster pace. Mo Chenggui immediately called for a meeting with Chu Lian and Tang Yang. He spoke bluntly and said that he was going to take House Jingen's private soldiers with him and head for the northern border first. Mo Chenggui was an old servant of House Jingen and was already biased against Chu Lian. He also looked down upon Tang Yang as a subordinate of Prince Jin. Even though he was supposedly having a discussion with Chu Lian and Tang Yang first before making the decision to leave, he was actually just informing them of his actions. Later in the afternoon, Mo Chenggui led House Jingen's soldiers and left. He even took along the secret bodyguards that matriarch he had sent to protect Chu Lian's safety. Thus, the size of the party was halved instantly. After another day had passed, the party finally passed by a small town and rested there for a night. However, when it was time to depart the next morning, Chu Lian was told that Tang Yang was having a high fever. She was speechless. Even though the weather had been terrible this whole time, she hadn't suffered even the slightest sniffle. Conversely, it was Tang Yang who had fallen sick from the bitter cold. When it rained, it poured. Although Tang Yang didn't practice martial arts, he wasn't a weakling by any means. However, as young as he was, he had never experienced such a harsh winter before and he was bedridden by illness. Tang Yang's high fever refused to break. His condition was getting worse and he couldn't even ride a horse, let alone the carriage. The party could only stay in the small town for another day. However, when it came to the following day, Tang Yang's condition hadn't improved at all. Chu Lian was starting to get impatient even as she worried over Tang Yang. A day or two's worth of delay was still acceptable. They could still make it in time if they rushed a little more on the last leg of the journey. However, on the third day, Tang Yang's sickness still hadn't improved. Without waiting for Chu Lian to speak, Tang Yang asked Chu Lian to make a move first. They left half of Prince Jin's men to take care of Tang Yang while Chu Lian and her group left first for the northern border. They couldn't bring much with them considering their smaller numbers, so they left most of the material goods with Tang Yang's group to bring along later. On the afternoon of the third day, Chu Lian led her party and left the small town. By now, they were only 3 days away from Liangju. Chu Lian took special care on the way. Finally, there was just a day left before they would finally reach the northern border. Just as the sky turned dark, Manager Qin ordered the carriages to stop. They found a dry clearing to rest for the night. After days of peaceful journey and Liangju nearly in their sights, they assumed their caution had paid off and they could reach the city without trouble. Who could have predicted they would get ambushed in the middle of their last night? Wenqing was the first to discover the attack with her sharp senses. Chu Lian was shaken awake by Wenlan. After getting informed of the situation, Chu Lian quickly pulled on her clothes and grabbed the keen dagger hidden under her pillow, hiding it in her sleeve. Despite the cutting, cold wind outside, Wenqing rushed into the tent carrying her sword, dressed only in her sleep clothes. Even though Chu Lian couldn't see Wenqing's expression in the dark, she could hear the worry and anxiety in her voice. "Third young madam, Someone's attacking us and their numbers are too much. We're not their match. You have to leave first, quickly." Then she turned to the stiff Wenlan and shouted, "Wenlan, what are you doing freezing up now? Hurry up, take third young madam with you and run. The horses are tied to the third elm tree next to this tent. Get third young madam on a horse and escape from here." Wenlan came to her senses after getting shouted at by Wenqing. She immediately pulled Chu Lian by the wrist and led her out of the tent. Once they left the tent, Chu Lian could hear the sounds of fighting as well as shouts in a language she couldn't understand. Under the flickering torchlight, she could see that their attackers were dressed in furs with their hair tied up in long, thin braids. Chu Lian's eyes narrowed. These people were barbarians. With broadswords in their hands and as equally ferocious actions as their appearances, they clearly stood out among the guards in Chu Lian's party. However, they weren't very skilled, rather, they depended on their massive physical strength when fighting the people of the Great Wu dynasty. One of the guards didn't dodge in time and Chu Lian watched with her own two eyes as his arm was lopped clean off. The guard collapsed on the ground and groaned in pain. The sounds of battle roared around them. Although Chu Lian couldn't bear to leave, her measly self-defense skills weren't enough to fend off the strong barbarians. As much as she wanted to stay and help fight off their enemy, she knew what her strengths were, and that certainly didn't include army formations or combat of any kind. Staying here would just be burdening them. Thus, Chu Lian bit her lip and followed Wenlan blindly, running after the tug on her arm. As their breaths shortened and their footsteps became heavier, they finally found the place where the horses were tied, as Wenqing had described. Wenlan was in the middle of untying the reins when they heard the sounds of conversation close by. Chu Lian turned in their direction. The voices of the three men running towards them sounded strange, and their footsteps sounded even stranger. TL note: while the translation for the term is broadsword, these Chinese broadswords aren't the same as the medieval English type of broadsword. They're a general term for curved swords and look like this: broadsword. Chapter 283, Help, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaronovels. Please read from the original source. The men were shouting in strange gibberish sounds. Chu Lian's brows furrowed together. Her expression turned grave and she immediately turned to Wenlan. "Be careful, Wenlan, these people are two hoons." They hadn't even reached the northern border and they were still within the territory of the Great Wu dynasty. How had the two hoons set an ambush for them here? Although Wenlan didn't know how Chu Lian had been able to tell that these people were two hoon, she had always put her full trust in Chu Lian. Wenlan gripped her wrist and forced Chu Lian onto a horse. As she held onto the reins, Wenlan looked up at Chu Lian and said, "Third young madam, run away first. This servant will hold them back." After saying so, without waiting for Chu Lian to speak, she slapped the horse on the rump. The red chestnut horse reared up in fright and let loose a cry before taking off. Chu Lian snatched the reins and held on for dear life. She crawled forward as far as she could on the horse's back and grabbed onto its neck. With the howling of the wind in her ears, Chu Lian could hear the sounds of battle getting further and further away. After a moment, she could hear hoofbeats replace them. Chu Lian hugged the horse's neck as tightly as she could. The cold wind cut against her face. She could really do no more than inwardly wail. Wenlan had been too concerned with protecting her that she had forgotten to ask if her master even knew how to ride a horse. This was just great. Even if she somehow evaded capture by the two hoons, she was going to be half dead from falling off a horse. As the horse charged out of the forest, the hanging branches of the trees forced Chu Lian into a sorry state. Before she could relax and try to control her steed, the sounds of hoofbeats from behind her increased in pace, as if someone had come chasing after her. Chu Lian's nerves were at an all-time high. She tried her best to hold onto the horse's neck with the reins in her grip. It took a little maneuvering, but she managed to balance herself properly before turning around to take a glance behind her. Chu Lian gasped, inhaling a mouthful of cold air. Those two hoons had come after her. When she had glanced back, the two hoons were actually not more than 20 meters away from her. A chill snuck down her spine. Chu Lian knew that she wouldn't meet a good end in the hands of the two hoon. Even if she managed to survive in the Tuhun's grasp and return to the Great Wu dynasty alive, her reputation would be ruined. Even though the Great Wu dynasty was more open-minded, they were still a feudal society, and females were on the losing end. Furthermore, going by how crazy He Sanlang was towards her even when her reputation was just fine, if she ended up getting kidnapped, he would probably write a divorce contract on the spot. Chu Lian forced herself to calm down and stop thinking of anything irrelevant to her situation. She gritted her teeth and plucked a hairpin from her head before stabbing the horse's rump viciously. The horse had already started slowing down. After getting stabbed, it went crazy and started sprinting forward again. Chu Lian couldn't care about anything else any longer. The only thing she could do was hug the horse's neck in a death grip and do her best to stay on its back as she was jolted around. The winter winds beat against her face like an endless wave of ice shards. The Tuhuns behind her seemed to be angered by her move. They shouted in gibberish she couldn't understand, but their tone clearly meant to scold. Even though Chu Lian couldn't understand, she didn't dare to look back again and clung to the horse. After the chasing Tuhuns realized that screaming angrily at her was useless, one of the Tuhuns spoke again and pulled out the bow he carried on his back. He drew out a sharp arrow from his quiver and notched it to his bow. Then, he pulled back the string so far back that the bow took the shape of the full moon, such a deep angle that it was nearly circular. Then, the Tuhun shut one eye and began to take aim at Chu Lian's back. Meanwhile, Li Xing and Li Yu were battling against the attacking barbarians with some other guards in their party. Although the barbarians didn't know martial arts, they had strength that the Great Wu people did not. Even though Li Xing and Li Yu were skilled at martial arts, they still couldn't hold back the combined attacks of so many strong barbarians at once. Soon, Li Xing blocked a blow for his sister and sustained a heavy injury. The barbarians were divided into two groups. One group was in charge of besieging the men that Chu Lian had brought along, while the other group was stealing away the party's supplies and luggage. The luggage from the carriage was all shifted onto horseback. Wenqing was tripped by a middle-aged barbarian. Just as that thick sword was about to land on her chest, Wenqing shut her eyes in fright. It didn't matter that she had been trained in martial arts since a young age, she still flinched back. And yet, even as she was scared beyond belief, Wenqing was still worried for her third young madam. She could only pray to the gods for third young madam's safety. Wenqing had thought that this would be the end of her life. However, the clash of metal on metal rang out in front of her, and the broadsword that should have slashed through her chest, didn't. The tip of the sword lost its original course and instead plunged into the tree behind her. Before Wenqing could recover from her brush with death, she heard an icy yet familiar voice say, "Where's your third young madam?" Wenqing abruptly opened her eyes and looked up, only to see a slender man dressed in black armor standing before her, with a huge beard. Wenqing's eyes almost popped out. Trembling with uncertainty, she said, Third young master?" He Changdi's expression was stormy as he shot a cold glare at Wenqing. "I asked you, where's Chu Lian?" Wenqing immediately came to her senses and ignored her injuries as she replied, "The situation was critical just now, so Wenlan took third young madam to escape in that direction. Third young master, please hurry." He Changdi didn't even wait for her to take another breath. Wenqing could barely catch him from the corner of her eye as he darted in the direction she had pointed in. TL note, just for fun and because I love horses, here's a picture of a red chestnut horse like the one Chu Lian's riding. Red chestnut horse. Chapter 284, Help, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volaronovels. Please read from the original source. With the help of the men that He Changdi had brought, the daring barbarian attackers were quickly captured. It was only when the grave-looking Mo Chenggui had come over to ask Wenqing about the situation that he found out He Changdi had chased after Chu Lian alone. Mo Chenggui quickly gathered a group of men to chase in the direction that He Sanlang had gone. By the time he realized that he was already on horseback and racing away, He Changdi wasn't sure what he was thinking. He was in disbelief with himself. He clearly hated that woman since she had caused his terrible fate in his past life. Now that he had reincarnated, he should be skinning her alive and torturing her for revenge. When had his feelings towards her started to change? As the cold winds howled in his ears, Changdi's heart was a mess. He had just realized that he couldn't put a name to his feelings towards Chu Lian in this life. However, one thing was clear. At this extremely critical juncture, he didn't want anything to happen to her, at least not now. When Changdi came across the gravely injured Wenlan with a dead Tu Hun next to her, his expression turned even gloomier. He asked Wenlan about Chu Lian's whereabouts. He only had enough time to throw a bottle of wound salve to Wenlan before racing off again. The Tu Huns. Changdi's eyes turned into black holes of loathing. He gritted his teeth, feeling the urge to tear apart every single Tu Hun he could find. He harumphed in his heart. Hadn't that wicked woman been full of tricks in his past life? She would get things done by hook or by crook, and her thoughts had been so orderly and refined. In his past life, she had driven him to such a terrible fate. How had she turned into such a weakling in this life? She was actually getting chased to death by the Tu Huns. Useless. While Changdi was complaining inwardly, it was only a deeply buried and undiscovered part of his psyche that realized his complaints were meant to reassure himself. It was as if remembering how wily and vicious Chu Lian was would mean that she would turn out perfectly fine while being chased by those Tu Huns. Weren't troublemakers supposed to have an extensive lifespan? What was getting chased by two measly Tu Huns in the grand scheme of things? She was definitely going to be all right. Changdi gripped his reins even tighter and whipped his horse forward. Even though Sanlang normally loved horses, in the current circumstances, he couldn't care about his own precious steed. He followed the hoofprints left by the Tu Huns and finally caught sight of them ahead. As he chased from behind, Changdi saw that there was a red chestnut horse galloping wildly in front of them. A small figure was sprawled over its back. The worries in his heart lifted the moment his eyes finally landed on Chu Lian. As expected, this wicked woman was a scourge on the earth. How could something happen to her so easily? However, his heart jumped back into his throat as he watched one of the Tu Huns aim his bow at Chu Lian's back. Changdi's pupils shrank as his arms moved faster than his thoughts. He took up his red-tasseled spear and threw it like a javelin. In the next instant, he could hear a Tu Hun scream. Changdi watched as the arms carrying the bow lost their strength, the bow dropping to the Tu Hun's side, the arrow falling over the horse's side to somewhere on the ground, lost for good. For some reason, when Sanlang thought of how that sharp arrow could have pierced Chu Lian's slender back and draw her crimson blood, his calm facade threatened to break into pieces. The injured Tu Hun clung to his horse with the red-tasseled spear lodged into his right shoulder. The tip of the spear had gone right through, poking out from his front and dyeing the fur there red. However, other than the initial cry of pain, the injured Tu Hun was now silent. Even though his face was deathly pale and covered in cold sweat, he didn't make another sound. He simply laid on his horse's back, keeping tense as he turned a hate-filled gaze onto Changdi, who had come up behind him in pursuit. Sanlang's brows drew together. Judging by his abnormal endurance, this Tu Hun probably wasn't a normal soldier. With this discovery, Changdi didn't dare to be careless. He drew the sword at his waist and charged forward. The Tu Hun clearly didn't dare to underestimate Changdi. Going by the armor he was wearing, the Tu Hun had more or less guessed that he was one of the Great Wu's high-ranking military officers. The other Tu Hun also drew his longbow and shot at Changdi. Horsemanship and archery were the Tu Hun's forte. Their warriors were all expert marksmen who could shoot a target with perfect accuracy. The Tu Hun fired off 7 or 8 shots. As skilled as Changdi was, and despite his harsh training in this lifetime as well as his daily training in the army, he couldn't dodge all the shots at such close range. Clinking sounds marked the number of times the longsword clashed with the arrows in midair. Although not a single one of the arrows injured Changdi gravely, his sword couldn't quite block all of them and he couldn't avoid getting a small scratch. The two Tu Huns hadn't expected Changdi to be so hard to deal with. When they saw that Changdi was getting closer and closer, the two of them exchanged glances and abandoned their chase to split up and flee. How could Changdi let them off so easily? With a quick tug of the reins, he started chasing after the Tu Hun who had shot at him. The horse Changdi was riding was fast. He caught up to that Tu Hun in no time. He swung his longsword once, twice, and that barbarian rolled off his horse, already dead, without any time to shout. When he turned around to chase the Tu Hoon who had been pierced by his red-tasseled spear, Changdi suddenly heard Chu Lian's shrill scream. TL note: your bit of gory trivia for the day: those red tassels on Sanlang's spear aren't just for decoration. They're meant to soak up the enemy's blood so that it doesn't run down the spear and make the spear slippery pouting face. And here are some pictures to illustrate the battle for you. Sanlang with his spear, imagined. Sanlang vs Tu Hoon warrior mounted Mongolian archer with longbow longsword. The world of Chinese swords, or Dao, is also pretty fascinating. You can read up on the history of the Dao and their types on the Wikipedia article, https://en. Wikipedia. Org wiki Dao_sword. Chapter 285, Beardy, 1. Sanlang's heart shook. He could no longer care about the escaping Tu Hoon, instead turning his gaze in Chu Lian's direction. His heart almost jumped out of his chest as he processed the sight that met his eyes. Under the faint, bleak moonlight, he could see that there was an endless cliff in front of Chu Lian. Chu Lian was about to cry. What was going on with her luck today? Just now, Chu Lian had put her full concentration on hugging the horse's neck and sticking onto its back without moving. She was so scared that she just shut her eyes tightly. When she actually heard some fighting and screams behind her, she wanted to open her eyes and turn around to look, but she wasn't able to. Even though she knew that help had come, the horse under her was still locked in its mindless craze. It charged towards the chasm in front without pause. Perhaps due to the stab she had given it earlier, the horse wasn't listening to any commands now. When she saw that the chasm was just mere meters ahead of her by now, Chu Lian chose to scream as loud as she could, hoping that the rescuer behind her who had stopped the Tu Hoons would find her and help her stop the horse. Changdi's expression was as dark as it could get. He ground his molars together and whipped his horse yet again, urging it towards Chu Lian's direction. However, as fast as his horse was, it was already too late to pull back the mad horse rushing over the cliff. Sanlang gripped the reins and pushed himself up to stand on the horse's back nimbly. He and Chu Lian were just 2 meters apart by now. Changdi used all the strength he could summon from his border and jumped towards Chu Lian with his arms open. A sudden force from behind pushed Chu Lian off the horse, and she landed in a strong and muscled embrace. Even though Chu Lian was still out of her wits in fear, when those arms appeared out of nowhere and hugged her, her wildly beating heart seemed to calm down. Although the two of them had managed to avoid the mad horse, the force Sanlang had used to push Chu Lian off still caused them to tumble down the steep hillside that looked like a chasm. A pair of strong arms held her tight, and one of the man's large hands pressed her head against his chest to act as a cushion at the same time. While in the man's embrace, Chu Lian felt her body getting jolted about before there was a dizzying sense of falling. Everything happened so fast that Chu Lian didn't even have the time to think about anything. She heard a few grunts of pain from the man above her, and all she knew was that they had tumbled down the steep hillside. When they finally came to a stop, both of them lost consciousness. A piercing ray of sunlight filtered through the dense canopy of the forest, causing Chu Lian to wake up. The moment she opened her eyes, she felt sore all over. Chu Lian tried to move her arms, but she quickly realized that she was being held in someone's embrace. The strong arms around her clearly belonged to a man, and one of them was even wrapped around her waist. This pose of his seemed distinctly possessive. Chu Lian stiffened as last night's memories came rushing into her mind like a flood. The ambush, the pursuit, the Tu Hoons, and finally, her rescue. She shifted her body, causing her to bare her teeth in reaction. She could feel that she wasn't severely injured anywhere, even though there was some soreness and a few pricks of pain from some minor scratches. Chu Lian reached out and tried to push away the man's arm, but no matter how she tried pushing and pulling, his arm didn't budge. It remained tightly fixed around her waist. Chu Lian had no other choice but to wiggle as far away from the man as she could and put some distance between them. Then, she sat up, still ensconced in his embrace. She could finally see what her savior looked like. When she noticed the giant beard covering half of the man's face, Chu Lian was flooded with shock. She continued staring at his bearded face for half a minute before recovering her wits. Chapter 286, Beardy, 2. The bearded man's appearance was just too shocking for her. When she thought back to the events of last night and looked at the man's hands, even though his fingers were thick and rough, the back of his hand was smooth and his fingers were long. Someone with skin like that should be a young man. Why did he look like a rough and unshaven old brute? The people of the Great Wu dynasty loved beauty, so even the men cared for their outer appearance. Chu Lian's own father, Chu Chijing, was completely clean-shaven despite his age. The young man by her side, on the other hand, didn't look older than 30, yet he touted such a thick beard around. What was up with that? Chu Lian was only stunned for a moment. She quickly realized there was something wrong with the man beside her. Her heart thumped and she reached out to touch the man's forehead. It was burning hot. She turned her attention to his thin lips and realized that they didn't have the distinct pink of health. Instead, his lips had lost all color and were peeling. By this time, Chu Lian couldn't care about the reservation between men and women in this dynasty. How could she place those fusty customs above the life of her own savior? Chu Lian started checking if the man had any wounds on his body, her brows tightly furrowed as she worked. The man's armor was still fine, so other than any internal injuries she couldn't check for, then there was only a single wound she had to attend to, a cut on the side of his neck that was also turning pale. Chu Lian did have some sort of knowledge in dressing wounds in the wild. She knew that she couldn't leave him just like that. The brows of the unconscious man were drawn together. Judging from his terrible expression, he seemed to be in a large amount of pain. Chu Lian took a deep breath and pushed harder at the arm encircling her waist before finally escaping from the man's embrace. She checked over the supplies she carried with her and heaved a sigh of relief. Luckily, the things she had on her hadn't been lost in the fall down the hill. Chu Lian untied a small gourd from her waist. She lifted the seal and carefully poured some of the honey water into the man's mouth. Although the man was currently unconscious, he still managed to swallow the honey water in his mouth out of reflex. It seemed like her savior had been poisoned. However, that was where her knowledge ended. She couldn't tell what kind of poison he was suffering from. Even though there was no harm in drinking honey water, Chu Lian didn't dare to give him too much of it. Chu Lian kept the small gourd and stood up to check the lay of the land around them, before tearing up the overly long hem of her dress and shoving it into her waistband. She then bent down, took in a deep breath, and used every single bit of her strength to drag the tall man into the shade of a pine tree and let him lean against the trunk. She pulled out the skirt length she had torn off and covered the man with it. She made a marking nearby before hobbling off to find some herbs in their surroundings that could help clear the poison from his system. Although she didn't know the exact herbs that could cure his condition, she did know of a few common herbs that could stop bleeding and alleviate the poisoning. Right after Chu Lian had left, the comatose He Sanlang suddenly mumbled, "Chu Lian." Unfortunately, Chu Lian was already gone by then. He was still worried for Chu Lian's safety, even though he was comatose. Who knew what he would feel when he woke up and found out that Chu Lian didn't even recognize her own husband? It was already winter now, and this area was close to the northern border, so it was much colder than the capital. Chu Lian hugged her sore arm and ran about the forest for about an hour before managing to gather a few herbs. By the time she returned to her savior, she found out that his body was trembling even though he was still in the throes of a high fever. Chapter 287, Spending the Night Together. 1. Chu Lian frowned and stood up to check her surroundings first. She then squatted down and placed the herbs she had just picked into her mouth, chewing them into a paste. She fed half of it to He Changdi and applied the other half to the wound on his neck. He Sanlang's brows were tightly furrowed, perhaps due to his sickly condition. Chu Lian touched his forehead a few times and tried to rub away the crease between his brow, but in the end, she could only leave him to it. Chu Lian went out to search for another hour and finally found a crude cave near a pile of earth. Even though the cave wasn't big, it was enough for at least a temporary shelter. It was the start of winter, and to make matters worse, they were in the middle of a mountain forest. They were still fine during the day, but when night fell or if the weather changed, even the healthiest man wouldn't be able to withstand the bitter cold. Well, you know what they say, speak of the devil and he shall appear. Just as Chu Lian finished checking around the cave, she poked her head out and heard the telltale pitter-patter of raindrops hitting the canopy above. Chu Lian cursed at the heavens and hurried back to where she had left He Sanlang. When she saw that her savior was still safe under the shade of the pine tree, she heaved a sigh of relief. Ignoring the rain pelting her face, Chu Lian lifted He Sanlang by the arm and prepared to head towards the cave. Unfortunately, He Sanlang was taller than Chu Lian by a whole head. He was also a strong, burly military officer with long limbs. How was a weak young lady like Chu Lian supposed to carry him over? But Chu Lian braved the icy rain anyway and used all the strength she had to heave the heavy weight on her shoulders towards the cave. The physical exertion quickly made her break out into a cold sweat. When she turned back to check, she had only shifted the man less than 5 meters in total. When she realized this fact, her remaining energy threatened to seep out of her limbs. Chu Lian wailed and collapsed on the ground. Without any support, the comatose He Changdi also fell right on top of her. Chu Lian wanted to cry from frustration. She stared at the man's broad shoulders and hit him twice, complaining, "Why do you have to be so big?" Her complaints were just to vent some frustration. Chu Lian really couldn't bear to leave her savior out in the rain, especially not in a random forest in the mountains. He had already been poisoned and was currently comatose. If he really got drenched by this bout of winter rain, he definitely wouldn't wake up at all. So, Chu Lian gritted her teeth and climbed up, pushing herself off the dry leaves of the forest floor. She managed to prop the man up against a nearby tree trunk, and after a moment of thought, she also took off her large cloak and wrapped it around the man. Although the cloak wouldn't be able to keep all of the rain off him, she couldn't let him get battered by it directly. After Chu Lian finished doing all that, she rubbed her trembling arms and walked deeper into the forest. This time, it took her an hour before she came back. Right at this time, He Changdi woke up for a short moment. He tugged groggily at the cloth obscuring his vision. His eyelids felt like they were covered in lead, and as he squinted through them, he caught sight of a familiar little figure dragging a crudely fashioned stretcher made from vines behind her. He wanted to stay awake a little longer, but his body felt like it was on fire. He couldn't control his mind and quickly fell back into unconsciousness. Chu Lian didn't think to check the man's condition. She placed the crude stretcher next to He Sanlang and rolled him onto it. The rain was getting heavier now, and as Chu Lian looked up at the sky, she knew she would have to hurry. After heaving a hapless sigh, she took up the vines to pull the stretcher and started heading towards the cave she had found. With the help of the stretcher, it was much easier to shift the man. However, even so, an hour had passed before they managed to reach the entrance of the cave. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.